Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're going to slip quietly into a version of the past that almost everyone thinks they understand, and almost no one actually does. Victorian England. Close your eyes and you probably see it already. Soft gaslight glowing through fog. Women in enormous skirts sipping tea with their pinkies raised. Men in tall hats tipping their brims politely to one another on cobblestone streets. A haze hanging over the city that looks, in your imagination, almost pretty, almost gentle, like something you could breathe in and feel calm. Tonight, we're going to take that picture apart, slowly, carefully, and completely. Because nearly everything you believe about the Victorians is some mixture of legend, exaggeration, or a story that simply outlived the people who lived it. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. This is a long, slow journey meant to be listened to with your eyes closed, drifting in and out as you like. There is no test at the end. There is only the quiet, strange, surprisingly human truth about an age we love to imagine and rarely understand. Let's start with a question. Were the Victorians really the buttoned-up, blushing, endlessly modest people we picture? Did they truly spend their days calmly drinking tea, or was something else often in the cup? Was that famous fog really as beautiful as the paintings suggest, or was it something closer to a slow poison? Did Victorian families cherish their children the way we imagine, or did many children simply become small, cheap laborers the moment they were old enough to work? And how did an entire society convince the centuries that followed that it was clean, moral, and dignified, while so much of what it actually did tells a very different story? Settle in. Because you have just opened the door onto a street in the middle of the 19th century, in the capital of the most powerful empire on earth, and it looks nothing like the postcard. We'll begin with perhaps the most famous myth of them all, the idea that Victorians were so extremely modest that they covered the legs of their furniture, because the sight of a bare table leg was considered indecent. It's a charming story. It has been repeated in classrooms, articles, and documentaries for generations. And it is almost certainly untrue, or at the very least, wildly overstated. Historians who have gone looking for solid evidence of widespread table leg covering have mostly come up empty. The myth appears to have grown out of jokes made by foreign visitors poking fun at what they saw as exaggerated British prudishness, jokes that somehow calcified into fact over the following century. Because here is the truth. Behind those high collars and lace curtains lived a society with an enormous, thriving appetite for exactly the kind of material it claimed to find scandalous. In London, there was an actual street, Holywell Street, just off the Strand, that was lined with shops selling erotic prints, racy novels, and material that would have made a respectable dinner guest faint on the spot, at least in public. This wasn't some hidden, whispered-about back alley. It was a known, functioning trade, one that operated for decades in the middle of the city, patronized by the same gentlemen who spent their daylight hours frowning at a woman's exposed ankle. There were private collectors who built extensive libraries of explicit material. There were underground publications trading in content that would still be considered explicit today. And running alongside all of this was an enormous sex trade. Historians estimate that in London alone, tens of thousands of women were working as prostitutes at various points during the Victorian era. Some estimates for certain periods run even higher. This was a society that lectured relentlessly about virtue and self-control from the pulpit and the newspaper column, while quietly sustaining one of the largest informal economies of vice in Europe. So, where did the story about table legs come from, if it wasn't quite real? Likely from something real but smaller, the Victorians did have genuinely strict rules about what could be said, worn, or discussed in public company. A woman was not supposed to raise certain topics at a dinner party. A man was expected to watch his language around the clergy or in front of women. These rules were real. But rules about public behavior are not the same thing as rules about private behavior, and the space between the two was enormous, roughly the size of the British Empire itself. You might say, think of it a bit like someone today who posts endless quotes about clean living and self-discipline on social media every morning, and then quietly does the exact opposite once the phone is put down. The Victorians were, in a sense, just extremely good at handwriting the public performance. They built a beautiful, polished surface of propriety, careful manners, lowered eyes, correct language, and underneath that surface, they lived lives that would have horrified the very same people had they seen it laid bare. The performance was the point. As long as the surface looked spotless, what happened beneath it was considered nobody's business. It's almost impressive, honestly, the scale of the commitment. An entire society agreed, more or less silently, to pretend collectively that it was far more virtuous than it actually was, and defended that performance so convincingly that we are still, more than 100 years later, largely buying it. They didn't cover table legs to protect anyone's innocence. If anything, they were covering their own tracks, protecting reputations rather than virtue. And they did it with real skill. Now, if the modesty myth turns out to be mostly theater, let's move to something a little more physical and a little less pleasant. Let's talk about how Victorians actually smelled. Forget the powdered ladies and freshly scrubbed gentlemen drifting through drawing rooms in a soft cloud of lavender. That is almost entirely a modern invention. Step into an actual Victorian street, and the first thing you would likely do is regret breathing in. For the vast majority of the population, a full bath was rare, not because people didn't want to be clean, but because being clean was genuinely difficult. Indoor plumbing existed, but it was a luxury of the wealthy, and even among the wealthy, it arrived unevenly across the century. For most families, hot water meant hauling buckets, heating them over a fire, and pouring them into a tin tub set up in front of the hearth. In many working-class households, the whole family might share that same water, one person after another, so that whoever bathed last was essentially washing in the leftover warmth and grime of everyone who came before them. The well-off had servants to prepare baths, scented soaps, and rosewater. Everyone else made do with a basin, a cloth, and low expectations. A quick wash of the face, hands, and neck in the morning was often the extent of daily hygiene for working people, who then went about long, physically demanding days. Clothing fared no better. Laundry was an exhausting, day-long task involving boiling water and harsh soap, and it simply couldn't be done often. So garments were worn repeatedly, for days or weeks, absorbing sweat, smoke, and street grime along the way. And the environment itself worked hard against anyone trying to stay clean. Victorian cities ran almost entirely on horsepower. Tens of thousands of horses pulling carriages, carts, and omnibuses through the streets every day, and every one of those horses left waste behind. The smell of manure was, quite simply, the smell of being outdoors in a major city. Add to that a blanket of coal smoke settling over everything, clothes, walls, lungs, and rivers that functioned as open sewers, and you have a city that had its own constant, layered odor, one that never really went away. In the poorest neighborhoods, several families might share a single outdoor toilet, and the resulting smell is something we can leave, mercifully, to the imagination. How did people survive inside all of this? Mostly by getting used to it. When everyone around you carries roughly the same mixture of smoke, sweat, and street grime, your sense of smell essentially stops flagging it as a problem. This isn't a myth. It's a well-documented psychological and physiological phenomenon called olfactory adaptation, or informally, nose blindness. A Victorian who did wrinkle their nose at a smell was likely reacting to something genuinely extreme, because the baseline itself was already very high. There was even a school of thought in some medical and social circles that excessive bathing was actually unhealthy, that it stripped away natural oils and left the body vulnerable to illness. Conveniently, this belief lined up perfectly with a society that found regular bathing logistically difficult anyway. So instead of washing more, many people focused on masking the smell, perfumes, scented pomades for the hair, and small handkerchiefs dabbed with fragrance and held to the nose in public. These weren't tools for getting clean. They were tools for being slightly less noticeable, so that rose-scented, powdered image of the elegant Victorian lady. In reality, She was very often a person working hard to smell like anything other than herself, in a city that was determined to undo her efforts by midday. It wasn't roses. It was closer to a truce. And speaking of things that hung over the city and refused to leave, let's talk about that famous fog. In your imagination, it curls gently around gas lamps while a mysterious figure in a long coat strolls past, and the whole scene feels moody and romantic, straight out of a novel. Let's correct that picture. What actually rolled through the streets of Victorian London was not a gentle countryside mist. It was a dense, choking mixture of coal smoke, soot, and industrial pollution, produced by a city that burned coal constantly, in homes, in factories, in workshops, day and night, all year round. When that smoke combined with naturally occurring fog under the right weather conditions, it created something new and genuinely dangerous. A thick, yellow-green haze that Londoners nicknamed a pea souper, because it was roughly the color and thickness of pea soup. These fogs could be so dense that people struggled to see their own outstretched hand. Londoners got lost on streets they had walked 1,000 times before. There are historical accounts of people wandering off the edge of embankments and falling into the Thames simply because they couldn't see where the pavement ended. During the worst fogs, some people made a modest living guiding pedestrians through the murk with torches or lanterns, which meant, essentially, trusting a stranger with an open flame to get you home safely. The fog wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public health emergency, one that recurred again and again throughout the century. The elderly, the very young, and anyone with pre-existing lung conditions were especially vulnerable, and death spiked noticeably during the worst episodes. Though at the time, these deaths were often absorbed quietly into the background, treated as ordinary bad luck rather than a citywide crisis. The most infamous of these events happened after the Victorian era technically ended, in 1952, the Great Smog of London. But the Victorian decades had already established the deadly pattern, again and again, on a smaller scale, largely unaddressed. The Victorians themselves were not oblivious. They wrote about the fog constantly, complained about it in newspapers, and understood perfectly well that it was filthy and dangerous to breathe. What they could not easily do was stop it, because stopping it would have meant stopping the coal fires that heated their homes and powered their factories. And coal was, in a very real sense, the engine of the entire empire. You don't get an industrial superpower without the chimneys, and you don't get the chimneys without the smoke that comes pouring out of them. So, in a very Victorian move, they romanticized what they couldn't fix. Writers gave the fog atmosphere and mystery. Painters were fascinated by the strange, glowing quality of light it created. It became a character in its own right, moody, mysterious, wrapped in intrigue, which is precisely why, generations later, we still picture it as something beautiful rather than something that was quietly killing people with every breath. Now let's turn to something almost every image of Victorian life includes: a nice, warm cup of tea. You probably imagine the Victorians as devoted, gentle tea drinkers, sipping calmly from delicate porcelain. The truth is a good deal murkier, and honestly, a good deal drunker. Let's start with the water, because that's really where the story begins. In crowded Victorian cities, clean drinking water was scarce and often genuinely dangerous. Much of it was drawn from sources contaminated by the same waste flowing through those open sewer rivers we just discussed. Drinking untreated water could easily give you cholera or typhoid, diseases that killed in enormous numbers throughout the century. So a great many people made what was, at the time, the more sensible choice. They drank alcohol instead, because the brewing or distilling process tended to kill off the worst contaminants. This meant that a significant portion of the population moved through an ordinary day mildly intoxicated, more or less as a matter of survival rather than indulgence. Weak beer, sometimes called small beer, was a common daily drink for adults and, in some households, even children, precisely because it was often safer than the water. Gin was cheap, widely available, and already infamous for the damage it did in poorer neighborhoods. Wine and spirits flowed freely among those who could afford them. The idyllic image of a sober, tea-sipping population simply doesn't match the reality of a country that was, for long stretches, quietly buzzed from breakfast onward as a basic precaution against disease. And even the tea itself often wasn't quite what it claimed to be. Food and drink regulation in the early and middle parts of the Victorian era was minimal to non-existent, and unscrupulous sellers took full advantage. Used tea leaves were sometimes dried out, dyed, and resold as fresh. Cheaper leaves, or even non-tea plant matter like hedge clippings, were mixed in to bulk up the weight of a batch. Some of the coloring used to make cheap tea look more appealing to buyers involved substances that had no business anywhere near something people were meant to drink. This wasn't limited to tea, either. It was part of a much broader pattern known as food adulteration, something we'll return to later, because it touched nearly everything on the Victorian table. For long stretches of the century, an ordinary person genuinely had very little way of knowing whether the tea in their cup, the bread on their plate, or the beer in their glass was actually what it claimed to be. Reformers and early chemists eventually began investigating and publishing reports exposing just how widespread the deception had become, and over time, laws were passed that slowly cleaned up the marketplace. But for decades, drinking a nice cup of tea was, in a very real sense, an act of blind trust. So the polite, refined tea ceremony you picture, the raised pinky, the delicate cup, sat on top of a much messier reality involving contaminated water, widespread alcohol consumption as a health precaution, and tea that was sometimes more hedge trimmings than actual tea leaf. Now let's step into the Victorian sickroom, because if you've been holding onto any hope that at least the doctors of this era knew what they were doing, it's time to gently let that hope go. By the middle of the 19th century, medicine had made real progress in some areas, but large parts of everyday medical practice still carried the ghost of much older ideas rooted in the ancient belief that illness came from an imbalance of fluids in the body, and that the cure involved removing something from the patient, whether that meant blood, vomit, or waste. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately cutting a patient and draining blood to rebalance them, lingered on for much of the century, even as evidence mounted that it did far more harm than good. A patient already weakened by fever or illness might be made weaker still, drained of blood they desperately needed, all in the name of treatment. It's a strange thing to imagine now, arriving at the doctor already exhausted and unwell, only to leave paler and fainter than when you walked in. Then there were the remedies themselves. Many Victorian medicines contained ingredients that today would set off every alarm bell imaginable. Mercury was used to treat a wide range of ailments, from skin conditions to syphilis, despite being highly toxic and capable of causing tremors, tooth loss, and organ damage with prolonged use. Various tonics and pills on the market contained heavy metals and other dangerous substances, dosed out with total confidence by sellers who had little real understanding of what they were dispensing. The line between medicine and slow poisoning was often thin, blurry, and crossed regularly, sometimes by respected physicians, sometimes by opportunistic salesmen. Speaking of salesmen, this era gave us the true, unforgettable stars of Victorian pseudo-healthcare, patent medicines. These were bottled tonics and syrups sold everywhere by everyone, promising to cure virtually anything: coughs, fatigue, nerves, female troubles, a bad temperament, general dissatisfaction with life. There was, it seemed, a bottle for every complaint, wrapped in confident branding and glowing testimonials. The catch was that these products were almost entirely unregulated. Manufacturers were not required to disclose their ingredients, and what those ingredients often included was alcohol, opium, morphine, or in some formulations, cocaine. This explains, rather neatly, why so many customers reported feeling remarkably better after just one dose. The tonic didn't cure the underlying illness. It simply made the drinker stop caring about it for a few hours. A cough syrup that is, in practical terms, a mixture of spirits and opium will absolutely quiet a cough and soothe anxious nerves. It will also, if taken regularly, create an entirely new and much more serious problem, one the label never mentioned, and one the seller had already moved on from by the time it appeared. These remedies were sold by traveling peddlers with wagons and rehearsed sales pitches, by pharmacists, and by shopkeepers of every kind, all riding on testimonials and confident promises rather than anything resembling scientific evidence. The seller needed a persuasive manner and a financial interest in your belief. The buyer needed a fever, a worry, and a coin. It was, in its own way, a perfect transaction, commercially brilliant, medically almost meaningless. To be fair to the era, this was also a century of genuine, transformative medical progress. This was the century in which the germ theory of disease began to take hold, slowly replacing centuries of guesswork with something closer to actual science. It was the century in which anesthesia was developed and refined, turning surgery from an agonizing ordeal into something a patient could survive without screaming through the entire procedure. It was the century that laid the groundwork for modern hospitals, public sanitation systems, and organized medical training. Brilliant, dedicated people were dragging the practice of medicine, sometimes quite literally kicking and bleeding, into the modern age. The problem was that these advances didn't arrive evenly or all at once. They were debated, resisted, and adopted gradually, often over decades, while mercury pills and opium-laced tonics continued selling briskly right alongside them. Whether you received competent, forward-thinking care or a bottle of flavored poison often came down to little more than luck, which doctor you happened to see, which pharmacist you happened to visit, and which decade of the century you happened to fall ill in. So if you assumed that by the height of the Victorian era, medicine had become something reliable, something you could simply trust, that assumption, unfortunately, does not hold up particularly well. Surviving the illness was only half the challenge. Surviving the treatment was very often the other half. And if adults had it rough in the doctor's office, the situation facing Victorian children was, in many cases, far worse. Picture the sentimental image often associated with this era, a rosy-cheeked child in a sunlit nursery, playing gently with a wooden hoop while a kind nanny watches over them. That scene did exist, for children born into comfortable, wealthy families. But for the vast majority of Victorian children, the sons and daughters of the working poor, childhood looked nothing like that at all. For working-class families, children were not seen primarily as a protected, sheltered stage of life to be nurtured and shielded from hardship. They were, quite bluntly, additional hands needed to keep the household fed. As soon as a child was physically capable of doing useful work, which, by modern standards, was alarmingly young, sometimes as early as 5 or 6 years old, that child was very likely to be put to work. Consider the chimney sweeps. Small boys, some barely more than toddlers by today's standards, were sent climbing up narrow, soot-filled chimney flues because their small bodies could fit into spaces no adult ever could. They climbed in complete darkness, scraping knees and elbows raw against brick and stone, inhaling soot with every breath in a way that permanently damaged their developing lungs. Accidents were common. Boys became stuck in narrow flues, sometimes fatally. It was dangerous, filthy work, handed specifically to children precisely because their bodies made them uniquely suited to it, a grim kind of qualification. In coal mines, children as young as 5 or 6 were employed opening and closing ventilation doors deep underground, sitting alone in total darkness for hours at a stretch, or hauling heavy loads of coal through cramped tunnels too small for adult workers. In textile mills, children darted beneath large, fast-moving machinery to clear jams and collect loose material, their small size making them useful, and their small hands making injury a constant, ever-present risk. The machinery did not pause or slow down to accommodate a child's inexperience or fatigue. The hours involved were staggering by any modern measure, often 12 hours or more in a single day, 6 days a week, in loud, dangerous, physically exhausting conditions. For most of these children, there was no school, no time set aside to simply be young. The very notion of childhood as a protected, extended period of growth and learning was, for much of the century, a privilege largely reserved for the comfortable classes. For everyone else, being a child mostly meant being a cheaper, smaller, more expendable worker. And cheaper is precisely the right word. Employers could pay child laborers a fraction of what an adult would earn for the same task, which created a powerful financial incentive to fill workplaces with young workers wherever possible. Families desperate for income needed every wage they could bring in, and so this grim cycle repeated itself across generations. Over the course of the century, this situation did begin to change, gradually and against considerable resistance. Reformers were horrified by what they documented in mines, mills, and factories, and their writing and advocacy eventually led to a series of legislative reforms, a string of factory acts and education acts that slowly raised the minimum working age, limited working hours for children, and began establishing the expectation that children deserved schooling and protection rather than a shift underground. Progress was real, but it was slow, contested at every step by industries that had grown comfortable relying on cheap, small labor. So when you picture the cherished Victorian child, keep in mind that for an enormous number of children, cherished was very much the wrong word for how the wider world treated them. They were loved by their families, certainly, often fiercely, by parents who had very little else to offer. But society at large regarded them, for a distressingly long stretch of the century, primarily as useful, inexpensive, and replaceable. Now let's step outside, away from the nursery and the factory floor, and take a look at the streets themselves. Because the tidy, orderly image of Victorian city life falls apart almost immediately once you look down at the pavement. Victorian cities ran on horsepower in the most literal sense possible. Carriages, cabs, delivery carts, and horse-drawn omnibuses filled the streets from morning until night. And collectively, the horses pulling all of that traffic numbered in the tens of thousands in a city the size of London. And every one of those horses produced waste, a lot of it constantly all day long. The resulting mess coated the streets in a mixture of manure, mud, and rainwater that was, depending on the weather, either a fine choking dust or a thick, slick, foul-smelling paste. This is where an entire small profession sprang into existence, the crossing sweepers. These were often children, stationed at busy street corners with brooms, who would sweep a clear path through the muck so that a well-dressed pedestrian could cross the road without ruining their shoes and hem. In exchange, they hoped for a small tip. Think about what that actually tells you about the state of the streets. An entire occupation existed solely because crossing an ordinary city road without assistance meant risking real damage to your clothing and possibly your health. The mess wasn't only horse-related, either. Many Victorian cities had inadequate drainage systems, meaning waste and runoff from workshops, markets, and homes often ended up seeping into the very same streets. Live animals were still routinely herded through city streets on their way to slaughterhouses, adding their own waste and occasional chaos to the general scene. Calling it a road undersells the situation somewhat. It was closer to an ongoing, unresolved event. Beyond the smell, which by this point in our journey you can probably imagine vividly enough, there was a genuine practical danger. All of that accumulated filth functioned as a highway for disease, and city streets became a shared surface where waste from thousands of sources mixed freely with the feet, hems, and daily errands of everyone who walked through them. People carried a little of the street home with them each day, tracked across floors, worked unavoidably into daily life. Cities did employ street cleaners to try to keep up with the mess, scraping and carting away what they could. But the horses never stopped producing waste, and so the job of cleaning the streets was, in practice, a losing battle fought over and over again, every single day, against an opponent that simply regenerated by the hour. So the crisp, orderly Victorian street of popular imagination, clean cobblestones, well-dressed crowds moving briskly under gas lamps, was, in reality, something closer to a churning, ever-present mess, patrolled by broom-wielding children hopping for spare coins, navigable only with real care and a certain amount of luck. Let's move indoors now, to the dinner table, because after everything we've already covered about the streets outside, you might reasonably hope that at least the food waiting at home was safe and honest. Settle into your chair, tuck in your napkin, and try not to think too hard about what's actually on your plate, because the truth about Victorian food is genuinely unsettling. For much of the early and middle parts of the century, before any meaningful food safety laws existed, the marketplace operated on a fairly simple and frankly ruthless principle. If a product could be made cheaper by adding something to it, and the customer had no easy way of finding out, then it very often was. This practice became known as food adulteration, and it wasn't a rare, isolated scandal. It was widespread routine, and touched nearly everything an ordinary family might buy. Bread, often called the staff of life, was one of the most commonly tampered with products. To make loaves appear whiter and to stretch the flour further, some bakers added alum, a chemical compound, and occasionally chalk or other cheap filler materials. The bread looked more appealing on the shelf and weighed more on the scale, which pleased the seller considerably. It did nothing good for the person eating it. Every ordinary slice of bread carried a small, invisible gamble. Milk fared no better. It was frequently watered down to stretch supply and increase profit margins, and in some cases, sellers added other substances specifically to disguise the fact that it had been watered down, or, more alarmingly, to mask early signs that it had started to spoil. Families buying milk for young children had very little way of knowing what they were actually pouring into a cup. Beer and spirits were sometimes tampered with to stretch quantities or mimic stronger flavors. Ground spices were bulked out with cheaper, less flavorful powders. Tea, as we've already discussed, was frequently padded with used leaves, dyes, or plant matter that had nothing to do with an actual tea plant. Pickled vegetables were sometimes brightened using copper-based compounds to achieve a more vivid, appetizing green color, a practice that, again, involved introducing a genuinely toxic metal into something meant to be eaten. But the story that tends to shock people most involves candy. Victorian confectioners sometimes used vividly colored, cheap dyes to make their sweets more visually appealing, and cut the sugar content with inexpensive fillers to increase profits. In one particularly notorious and well-documented incident in the English city of Bradford in 1858, a batch of peppermint candies known as humbugs was accidentally made using arsenic trioxide instead of the harmless filler the candy maker intended to use, due to a mix-up at the supplier. The result was a mass poisoning. Historical accounts suggest around 20 people died, and many more became seriously ill from something as ordinary and innocent as buying candy at a local shop. The scandal caused public outrage and became one of the key events that eventually pushed lawmakers toward taking food safety seriously. Think about what that really means. An ordinary family in Victorian England could not fully trust their bread, their milk, their tea, their beer, or their children's candy. The most basic, everyday act of feeding a family involved a level of hidden risk that would be almost unthinkable today. There were no reliable labels, no routine inspections, no simple way to test what you'd bought. People purchased, ate, and hoped for the best, which, by this point in our journey through the era, should sound like a familiar pattern. Eventually, the scale of the problem became too large to ignore. Chemists and public health reformers began systematically analyzing food products and publishing detailed, damning reports on just how widespread and dangerous adulteration had become. Public outrage grew, and over time, though it took years of campaigning, laws were passed that gradually brought real oversight and honesty to what people were being sold. Landmark legislation like the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, and later more comprehensive food safety laws, slowly transformed the marketplace. But for a long stretch of the century, the wholesome Victorian meal you might imagine was, in practice, a comforting fiction sitting on top of a fairly nervous reality. Now, if you manage to survive dinner, let's retire to the drawing room to relax and admire the walls, because they were, in a very literal sense, some of the most dangerous decor choices in the history of interior design. That gorgeous, vivid, jewel-toned green wallpaper that was so wildly fashionable through much of the Victorian period. For a significant stretch of the century, the pigment used to create that particular shade of green very often contained arsenic. This wasn't a fringe back-alley product. It was one of the most popular sought-after colors of the age, prized because it was vivid, long-lasting, and relatively cheap to produce compared to other dyes of the time. The pigment, sometimes referred to by names like Scheele's green or Paris green, made its way not only into wallpaper but into paint, fabric, artificial flowers, candles, children's toys, and even some food coloring. For a while, this seemed like a genuinely wonderful bargain, a beautiful, affordable color that didn't fade the way other options did. Households across the social spectrum, from modest homes to grand estates, decorated their walls with it enthusiastically. An entire nation, in effect, wallpapered its parlors and its nurseries in a shade that happened to be quietly, invisibly toxic. The danger came from the fact that arsenic in the wallpaper didn't necessarily stay put. In damp conditions and Victorian homes, with poor ventilation and frequent dampness, had plenty of those. Certain molds could react with the arsenic compounds in the wallpaper and release toxic arsenic-containing gas into the air of the room. This was a slow, invisible process that occupants breathed in night after night with absolutely no idea anything was wrong. Flakes and dust from deteriorating wallpaper could also come loose, and in a warm, humid nursery where a small child spent most of their day, the cumulative effect could be genuinely harmful. Historical records document real cases of families falling mysteriously ill in beautifully decorated homes, of children in particular showing unexplained symptoms, and of health improving noticeably once a family, sometimes by accident, sometimes through investigation, removed the green wallpaper from their walls. Some physicians and scientists at the time began connecting these patterns, and prominent voices, including the famous chemist and public health advocate William Corbould, and notably the popular press, began warning that the fashionable green color might be responsible. But the color remained popular for years after these warnings first surfaced, because it was beloved, profitable, and the connection wasn't universally accepted right away. People, it turned out, loved their green wallpaper more than they feared it. Imagine choosing a paint color today because it looks stunning, hanging it in a nursery, and only gradually discovering that the room itself seems to be making everyone in the household unwell. That is essentially the situation some Victorian families found themselves in, decorating with genuine enthusiasm, and unknowingly poisoning themselves with considerable style. What makes this particular danger so striking is how thoroughly ordinary and respectable it was. This wasn't some obscure risk confined to slum housing. This was the choice of comfortable, house-proud, middle-class, and even wealthy families, reaching for the most admired, most fashionable color available, and unknowingly bringing a slow, low-level poison into the heart of their own home. Eventually, as evidence mounted and public awareness grew through the later decades of the century, arsenic-based pigments gradually fell out of favor, and manufacturers shifted towards safer alternatives. But for decades, that gorgeous green hung on the walls of countless respectable homes, admired daily, dusted regularly, and breathed in constantly. Now let's talk about wealth, because the British Empire at its height controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and population, and commanded staggering global wealth. Given all that, it would be natural to assume the average Victorian citizen was living rather comfortably as a result. That assumption falls apart almost immediately once you actually look at how that wealth was distributed. The riches generated by the empire were real, enormous, and genuinely world-changing. But they were also concentrated in the hands of a relatively narrow slice of society. The industrialists who owned the factories, the financiers who managed the investments, the landowners whose estates had been in their families for generations, and the merchants who controlled global trade routes. For this class, the Victorian era truly was something close to golden, grand houses, servants numbering in the dozens, fortunes that are difficult to fully comprehend even by today's standards. That glittering world existed, and it's the world that tends to dominate our collective memory of the era. The world of elegant townhouses, lavish balls, and grand estates. But it was, in a very real sense, a thin layer sitting on top of a much larger, much harder reality. Below that glittering surface lived the overwhelming majority of the Victorian population, and their experience of the greatest empire on earth mostly consisted of long hours of hard labor, extremely tight budgets, and constant, grinding insecurity. For every gentleman comfortably managing his investments from a study, there were countless families crammed into a single rented room, working brutally long hours for wages that barely covered rent and basic food, often just one illness or one lost job away from genuine catastrophe. What makes this inequality particularly striking, historically, is how physically close these two worlds actually were. This wasn't a case of the wealthy living in one distant region and the poor confined to another. Grand mansions and desperately overcrowded slums frequently existed within the very same cities, sometimes only a short walk apart. A person could walk, in the span of a few minutes, from a neighborhood of extraordinary luxury into a warren of genuine deprivation, and back again. The entire staggering scale of Victorian inequality could often be observed along the length of a single street. In London's poorer districts, areas like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, and parts of the East End, families packed into housing that was damp, poorly maintained, and deeply overcrowded, often sharing water sources and sanitation facilities among far too many households. Whole neighborhoods lived perpetually close to the edge, and when circumstances turned difficult, illness, job loss, a bad winter, families could fall from barely managing straight into destitution, hunger, and in many cases, the dreaded workhouse, which we'll examine in detail shortly. And troublingly, the poor were often blamed for their own circumstances by more comfortable observers who had never experienced factory labor or genuine hunger themselves. It was, in many respects, simply easier and more comfortable to believe that poverty reflected some personal failing of character than to acknowledge that an economy generating unimaginable wealth was systematically leaving the majority of its own population behind. Picture it this way. Imagine standing just outside the doors of the most spectacular banquet imaginable, tables groaning under the weight of food, guests dressed in extraordinary finery, and being told that the reason you're standing hungry in the street outside is some flaw in your own character, rather than simply how the system happened to be arranged. That was, in effect, the daily reality for a great many Victorians, living in close physical proximity to wealth they had helped generate through their labor, and would very likely never come close to touching themselves. So the notion that the British Empire's wealth lifted the fortunes of ordinary Victorian citizens broadly is, in many respects, one of the more quietly misleading ideas about the era. It made a relatively small number of people extraordinarily rich, and it relied on the labor of a much larger number of people who remained poor throughout their lives. Now let's address one of the most enduring and dramatic myths of the entire era, the one wrapped tightly around the Victorian woman's waist. You've almost certainly heard the stories. Women laced into corsets so tight they regularly fainted from lack of oxygen. Ribs surgically removed to achieve an impossibly small waist. Internal organs permanently crushed and displaced in pursuit of an exaggerated hourglass figure. These stories make for excellent drama, and they show up again and again in films, novels, and popular history articles. Most of it, according to historians and even fashion historians who have studied surviving garments closely, is significantly exaggerated. Let's start with what a corset actually was for most Victorian women, because the word has accumulated so much myth over time that people often forget its ordinary, everyday purpose. For the vast majority of women, A corset functioned essentially as a supportive undergarment, the practical foundation layer you put on each morning, not unlike how someone today might reach for a supportive bra or structured shapewear. It gave shape to an outfit, provided back support during long hours of physical labor, and created the silhouette expected by the fashion of the day. Working women wore corsets while doing genuinely demanding physical labor. Farmers' wives wore them in the fields. Domestic servants wore them while scrubbing floors and hauling water. It's worth pausing on that fact alone. You simply do not perform hours of hard physical labor in a garment that regularly leaves you gasping or unconscious. The dramatic image of the delicate, swooning woman, one hand pressed to her forehead as she collapses onto a fainting couch, owes a great deal more to Victorian melodrama, romantic fiction, and later theatrical exaggeration than it does to everyday reality. Tight lacing, deliberately cinching the waist to an extreme dramatic degree, absolutely did exist as a practice, and some fashionable women, particularly among the upper classes, did pursue it for special occasions or as a more extreme fashion statement. But historians generally agree this was a minority pursuit, taken to genuinely alarming extremes by a relatively small number of people. And even among those who did practice tight lacing, the far more extreme, waist-crushing versions described in popular myth were rarer still. The everyday corset worn by the average Victorian woman was, in practice, a supportive tool rather than an instrument of torture. As for the rib removal claim, the idea that fashionable women were routinely having ribs surgically removed to achieve a smaller waist, there is essentially no credible historical or medical evidence that this was ever a widespread practice. Consider the state of Victorian surgery, which we've already examined at length. This was an era in which even a routine surgical procedure carried a very real risk of death from infection alone, when anesthesia was still relatively new and imperfect, and when undergoing any operation was a genuine gamble with your life. The idea that large numbers of fashionable women were casually undergoing elective rib removal surgery purely for cosmetic reasons and routinely surviving the experience simply doesn't hold up against what we know about the genuine dangers of Victorian surgery. It's a striking image, but it belongs more to legend than to documented medical history. So, where did this exaggerated version of events come from? Likely from a combination of sources. Partly from those genuine extreme cases of tight lacing, which existed and were sensationalized in newspapers and cautionary medical writing at the time, then exaggerated further with each retelling, until the rare exception became mistaken for the general rule. Partly from a broader cultural tendency, both at the time and in later generations, to look back at the Victorians as somewhat absurd and oppressive, with the fainting, corseted woman becoming a convenient, vivid symbol of that broader critique. And partly from the corset's genuine, real discomforts, because an ill-fitting corset, or one laced too tightly even by ordinary Victorian standards, absolutely could pinch, restrict breathing to some degree, and become genuinely unpleasant in a hot, crowded room. That last point deserves real acknowledgement, because it's not simply a myth to be dismissed. Corsets were not always comfortable. Fashion of the era did place genuine, sustained pressure on women to conform to a particular body shape, and the more extreme forms of lacing could and did cause breathing difficulty and other documented health complaints. The broader critique of restrictive Victorian fashion standards for women isn't wrong. It's just that the popular modern version of the story has inflated a real, legitimate issue into a more lurid, dramatic tale of daily fainting spells and surgical mutilation that doesn't match the documented historical record particularly well. Think of it as somewhat comparable to modern shapewear or fashionable but uncomfortable footwear, genuinely uncomfortable and even harmful in extreme cases, but a normal, unremarkable part of daily dressing for most people who wore it. The average Victorian woman got dressed, laced her corset to a reasonably comfortable degree, and went about a long, physically demanding day, much like everyone else. Now let's open the Victorian family medicine cabinet, because this is where the era's carefully cultivated image of sober self-discipline runs into some genuinely surprising reality. The Victorians liked to present themselves publicly as restrained, disciplined, and morally upright. So it may come as a real surprise to learn that they were, quite legally and quite openly, deeply immersed in what we would today classify as serious narcotics. Open an average Victorian household's medicine cabinet, and you would very likely find substances that would today require a doctor's prescription, extensive warning labels, and possibly police involvement, sitting casually between the sugar and the tea leaves. Opium was, without question, the great workhorse substance of the era, legally available and used for an enormous range of purposes. Its most famous and widely used form was laudanum, a tincture made by dissolving opium in alcohol, sold cheaply and legally at essentially any pharmacy or chemist's shop, and kept in a great many homes as a genuine all-purpose remedy. Persistent cough, laudanum. Difficulty sleeping, laudanum. General aches, anxious nerves, menstrual cramps, or what we might today casually call a rough week, laudanum, taken by the spoonful, with no prescription required and very little oversight of dosage. It functioned in practice as the era's aspirin, sleeping pill, and stiff drink, all rolled into one small, unremarkable bottle available at nearly any shop. And opium wasn't the only substance in wide legal circulation. As the century progressed, morphine and later, cocaine found their way into a range of tonics, lozenges, and patent remedies, marketed confidently for everything from persistent coughs to toothaches to general fatigue and low spirits. Respectable, ordinary people used these substances routinely and without any particular sense of shame. Well-known writers and poets of the era were famously associated with laudanum use. Housewives used tonics to manage their nerves. The line between medicine and what we would now recognize as recreational drug use was blurry to the point of being essentially invisible, largely because the very same bottle often served both purposes simultaneously, and there was little cultural framework in place yet to separate the two. Now for what is genuinely one of the more troubling aspects of this history. Among the most popular and widely purchased remedies of the era were soothing syrups specifically marketed for bobbies and small children, intended to quiet fussiness, ease teething pain, or help an infant sleep. A great many of these products were, in plain terms, opium-based preparations given directly to infants. Products with names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup were sold widely and marketed with entirely reassuring, gentle branding. Despite containing morphine, a fussy, teething, crying baby could be quieted with a spoonful of a substance that was, in straightforward terms, a narcotic. It worked, in the sense that the crying stopped. In some documented cases, tragically, it worked far more permanently than any parent ever intended, because a substance strong enough to sedate an adult is an extremely dangerous thing to administer, even in small amounts, to an infant. Exhausted parents, overworked nurses caring for multiple children, and desperate families used these syrups widely, generally trusting the cheerful labels and reassuring branded names, with very little accurate understanding of what they were actually giving their children or how easily an accidental overdose could occur. Historians studying infant mortality records from the period have noted these soothing syrups as a documented contributing factor in a number of infant deaths, though precise figures are difficult to establish with certainty given the record-keeping standards of the time. It stands as one of the quieter, more uncomfortable tragedies of the era, a culture that took real pride in discipline and self-restraint, while routinely and legally sedating its own infants with the best of intentions and remarkably little accurate information. How was any of this legally possible for so long? Because for the majority of the century, there was minimal regulation governing what substances could be sold, to whom, and in what quantities. These products were legal, inexpensive and available essentially everywhere, sold by licensed pharmacists, general shops, and traveling salesmen alike, wrapped in the same confident, reassuring promises as any other product on the shelf. There was little organized warning system and minimal oversight. You purchased opium in much the same casual way you might purchase flour, and carried it home in the very same shopping basket. Public understanding and regulation did shift gradually over the final decades of the century, as the dangers of addiction and accidental overdose became harder to ignore, culminating eventually in legislation like the Pharmacy Act of 1868, which began restricting the sale of certain dangerous substances, and later, more comprehensive regulations in the early 20th century. But for long stretches of the Victorian era, a society that prided itself publicly on discipline and moral restraint was, in practice, gently and pervasively medicated, from the celebrated poet working at his desk to the infant sleeping, sedated in the cradle. Now let's turn to the woman whose name defines this entire era, Queen Victoria herself, because the popular image of her is, in significant ways, quite far removed from who she actually was. The image is fixed firmly in popular imagination, a small, stern, perpetually black-clad woman, glaring disapprovingly from portrait after portrait, famously declared to have said, "We are not amused." It's a memorable, frequently repeated impression. It's also, like a great deal of what we've covered tonight, considerably more complicated than the popular version suggests. Let's start with that famous phrase itself. Historians have genuine, well-documented doubts about whether Queen Victoria ever actually said, "We are not amused," in the context popularly attributed to her, or whether, if she did say something similar, it has been taken out of context and turned into a kind of shorthand for a personality that doesn't fully match the historical record. It has become a convenient catchphrase representing a stern, humorless character, one single frozen expression standing in for a genuinely long, complex, and in many ways surprisingly passionate life. The real woman behind that famous, stern portrait was considerably more complex than the popular caricature suggests. For one thing, by her own extensive written accounts, and Victoria was a prolific diarist and letter writer throughout her life, she was deeply, intensely in love with her husband, Prince Albert. Her devotion to him was emotional, openly expressed in her private writings, and by several historical accounts, occasionally startled even her own advisors and household staff with its intensity. This was not, by the documented evidence, a cold, dutiful, arranged marriage kept carefully at arm's length. It was, by all indications, a genuine and passionate partnership, conducted at the very top of a society that officially preferred its emotional displays kept firmly private. By multiple historical accounts, Victoria also had a genuine sense of humor. She reportedly laughed easily and heartily in private company, held strong personal opinions, had a notably quick temper, and threw herself with real enthusiasm into her personal interests. In her younger years, she was known to enjoy music and dancing considerably. She and Albert developed a genuine fondness for the Scottish Highlands, eventually building Balmoral Castle as a personal retreat, where she reportedly felt considerably freer than amid the formal rigidity of court life in London. She sketched, she painted with some genuine skill, and she wrote extensively and candidly in personal journals throughout her life. Journals that historians have used extensively to reconstruct a much fuller picture of her personality than the popular stern caricature allows. So where does the popularly remembered image of perpetual gloom actually come from? From genuine, profound grief. When Prince Albert died in 1861, relatively young, at just 42, Victoria was devastated in a way that reshaped the remainder of her long life. She withdrew substantially from public life for an extended period, adopted mourning dress that she would, in fact, continue wearing in some form for the rest of her life, nearly 40 years, and sank into a depth of sorrow that genuinely worried both her family and the wider public, and which drew real criticism from some quarters at the time for her prolonged withdrawal from royal duties. Here's the crucial point about timeline that the popular image tends to leave out entirely. That withdrawn, perpetually mournful figure represents primarily the second half of her reign, following Albert's death. For the first half of her reign, roughly 2 decades, she was a considerably younger, more lively, opinionated monarch, newly crowned in her teens, married for love in her early 20s, and by most historical accounts, engaging enthusiastically with both life and her role as queen. She was, in the fuller historical record, a genuinely passionate young woman for a longer stretch of her reign than she was ever the grieving widow in black that popular imagination tends to remember. But popular memory, as it often does, gravitated toward the single most visually striking and emotionally dramatic image, the widow in mourning, and largely set aside the earlier decades. It's worth considering how genuinely unfair that would be applied to almost anyone's life. Taking someone who lived for decades, who laughed and argued and loved and grieved across a full and complicated existence, and reducing the entirety of how they're remembered to a single portrait captured during their most sorrowful chapter. None of this is meant to suggest Victoria was without flaws, and historians have documented plenty of them. She held political opinions that were, at times, genuinely difficult, and her long reign included real controversies. But the popular image of her as simply stern, humorless, and permanently disapproving is, at best, a significant oversimplification of a much richer and more complicated historical figure. Let's address one of the more unsettling myths that circulates widely on the internet: the claim that Victorians were obsessively fixated on photographing their dead, propping up corpses in lifelike poses, painting eyes open, and arranging them into cheerful family portraits as though nothing at all were wrong. It's a genuinely creepy idea, and it has spread far and wide precisely because it's so vivid and unsettling. It's also, in most of its more dramatic details, not accurate. Let's separate the documented reality from the exaggerated legend. Postmortem photography did exist, and it was a real, if uncommon, practice. In an era when photography itself was still a relatively new, expensive, and time-consuming technology, and when the death of infants and young children was tragically common, infant mortality rates in Victorian England were, by modern standards, extremely high, particularly in overcrowded urban areas. Some grieving families made the difficult decision to have a final photograph taken of a child who had died. Very often, this photograph would show an infant or young child arranged as if peacefully sleeping, dressed carefully, sometimes surrounded by flowers. For a family that might otherwise have no photograph at all of that child, this was frequently the only image they would ever possess of their son or daughter, and by most historical accounts, it was treated as a precious, deeply personal keepsake rather than anything morbid or unusual by the standards of the time. That is the documented, genuine truth of the practice, and it's considerably more tender and understandable than the more sensational modern retellings suggest. It was not, according to historians who have studied surviving collections of Victorian photography, a widespread obsession or a common cultural craze. It was a relatively rare, deeply personal act of grief, undertaken by families who had lost someone they loved, and wanted a final image in a world where photographs were still genuinely difficult to obtain. Now, as for the more dramatic, widely circulated internet claims, corpses supposedly propped upright on hidden metal stands, posed standing among living family members, with painted open eyes staring out at the camera. These claims are, according to most photography historians, largely based on a significant misunderstanding. Metal posing stands did exist and were used during this era, but they were used on living subjects, not deceased ones. Early photography required extremely long exposure times, sometimes stretching to many seconds or even longer depending on lighting conditions, and holding a completely still pose for that length of time was genuinely difficult for a living person. A discrete metal or wooden brace, often positioned behind the neck and largely hidden by clothing, helped a living subject remain steady enough to produce a clear, unblurred photograph. So a great many photographs that circulate online today, captioned as haunting images of standing corpses, are, according to photography historians, simply ordinary portraits of very still, very serious-looking living people, people who appear stiff and solemn largely because they had been instructed not to move for an extended period, and because genuine smiling in formal portrait photography was not yet fashionable or expected during this period. The unsmiling, rigid Victorian expression you see in old photographs is generally a reflection of slow camera technology and formal photographic convention, not a sign that the subject was deceased. Add a century of distance, unfamiliar old-fashioned clothing, and an eerie modern caption, and an ordinary bored relative sitting for a formal portrait becomes, in modern retellings, something closer to a reanimated ghost. The confusion is understandable in a sense. Old photographs genuinely do look strange and distant to modern eyes. The poses are formal and stiff, the expressions grave, the overall aesthetic quite unfamiliar. It's easy to look at a solemn, motionless historical photograph and let your imagination fill in a more dramatic story than what actually happened. But in the vast majority of cases, historians agree the more mundane explanation, a formal portrait of someone very much alive, told to hold still, is the accurate one. The Victorians did have an elaborate, deeply serious relationship with death, mourning, and remembrance, which we'll examine more closely shortly, and that part of the historical record is genuinely striking and worth taking seriously. But the specific, widely circulated claim that they were routinely posing propped-up corpses by the thousands for family photographs is largely a modern exaggeration. A real, gentle historical practice twisted, through generations of retelling, into something considerably darker than the documented reality supports. Now let's return to the operating table, because you may still be holding onto some hope that even if the tonics were questionable and the streets were filthy, at least Victorian surgeons were competent and reasonably clean. Let's address that hope directly, because unfortunately, for much of the century, it doesn't hold up particularly well either. For a significant portion of the Victorian era, the connection between cleanliness and infection was poorly understood by the medical establishment, and in some cases, actively resisted even when evidence began to emerge. A surgeon might move directly from one patient to the next without washing his hands at all between procedures. He might operate wearing the same coat, day after day, stiffened and darkened with the dried blood of previous patients. And rather than viewing this as something to be ashamed of, some surgeons of the era genuinely regarded a visibly blood-stained coat as a mark of experience and a busy, respected practice. The dirtier the coat in this strange inverted logic, the more impressive and established the surgeon appeared to be. This runs directly counter to everything we now understand about infection control, and it was practiced with genuine, confident conviction by respected medical professionals of the time. The idea that invisible microorganisms might be transmitted on unwashed hands or unsterilized instruments, and that this might explain why so many surgical patients survived the operation itself only to die from infection days later, was introduced gradually over the course of the century and met with significant resistance in many quarters. The Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis famously proposed, in the 1840s, that doctors washing their hands between patients could dramatically reduce deaths from infection in maternity wards, and was largely ridiculed and dismissed by much of the medical establishment of his time, despite compelling supporting evidence from his own hospital data. It would take further decades, along with the pioneering work of figures like Joseph Lister, who developed antiseptic surgical techniques in the 1860s using carbolic acid to sterilize wounds and instruments, before cleanliness in surgery became widely accepted medical practice. Until these ideas gained real acceptance, Hospitals could be genuinely dangerous environments where infection spread readily from patient to patient, and a hospital stay could, in a meaningful number of cases, do a patient more harm than the original illness or injury that brought them there in the first place. Surviving the surgery itself was frequently only the first hurdle. Surviving the days and weeks that followed, as the body fought off whatever infection the procedure may have introduced, was very often the more difficult test, and a substantial number of patients did not pass it, because reliable pain relief was limited or entirely absent for much of the earlier Victorian period. Speed became a highly valued surgical skill. A fast surgeon was, quite reasonably, a celebrated surgeon, because a quicker operation meant less time spent by the patient in extreme, unmedicated pain. The most skilled and famous surgeons of the pre-anesthesia era, figures like Robert Liston, became known for performing amputations in a matter of minutes, working at remarkable speed in front of a watching audience of students and observers, since surgery in this period was frequently conducted as something close to a public demonstration. Speed genuinely did reduce a patient's suffering, but a blade moving that quickly, in a room with no real understanding of infection control, carried its own significant risks. Picture the full scene. Minimal or no reliable pain relief in the earlier decades, no meaningful understanding of infection, instruments that had not been properly sterilized, a surgeon operating in a visibly blood-stained coat, working at high speed in front of an observing crowd of students. It bears little resemblance to what we would now recognize as competent modern medical practice, and yet, by the genuine standards and understanding of the time, it represented the best care available, administered by respected, well-intentioned professionals who sincerely believed they were doing right by their patients. To give the era its full due, this was also the century in which surgical practice began to transform dramatically for the better. The introduction of ether and later chloroform as anesthetics in the 1840s turned surgery from an agonizing, terrifying ordeal into something a patient could survive calmly and, crucially, without excruciating pain. Lister's antiseptic methods, once finally accepted, dramatically reduced post-surgical death rates from infection. Germ theory, once dismissed by many, eventually became the accepted foundation of modern medical practice. By the closing decades of the era, medicine had been transformed almost beyond recognition compared to where it began. But for a great many patients treated earlier in the century, that transformation arrived too late. If you managed to survive your visit to the surgeon with all your limbs intact, there was still the matter of your teeth to worry about. And that particular chapter of Victorian life has its own genuinely striking history. Sugar consumption increased significantly across the Victorian era as it became more affordable and widely available, meeting a population with very limited understanding of, or access to, effective daily dental care. Regular toothbrushing was not yet the established daily habit it is today, and the combined result of rising sugar consumption and minimal dental hygiene was widespread, severe tooth decay across nearly all social classes. Cavities were extremely common. Toothaches were, for enormous numbers of people, simply an accepted, ongoing fact of daily life, and a mouth full of aching, decaying teeth was closer to the norm than the exception for much of the population. When a tooth became too painful or too badly decayed to save, the standard solution was rarely any kind of careful repair. It was straightforward extraction. Pulling teeth was the default response to serious dental trouble, and for much of the earlier Victorian period, before reliable anesthesia became standard in dental practice as well as surgery, this meant having a tooth physically removed while fully conscious, gripping the arms of the chair through what was, by every account, a genuinely brutal and painful experience. Once a person had lost a significant number of teeth, and for many Victorians, particularly those from poorer backgrounds with limited access to any dental care at all, this was common. There was real demand for dentures to replace them. And here the story takes a genuinely striking historical turn. The most natural-looking, comfortable dentures available during this period were not made from porcelain or carved ivory, which were both more expensive and less comfortable options, but from real human teeth, cleaned, fitted, and set into a denture base for a paying customer. Where did these teeth actually come from? Documented historical sources indicate they were collected from multiple sources, from the recently deceased, from grave robbing in some documented instances, and most famously, from battlefields following major conflicts. This practice reached a notorious peak following the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, when teeth collected from the bodies of thousands of fallen young soldiers were gathered, cleaned, and shipped back to Britain to be fashioned into dentures, which became known, somewhat grimly, in the trade as Waterloo teeth. Teeth taken from young, healthy soldiers were considered particularly desirable precisely because their owners had been young and had died suddenly rather than from illness, meaning their teeth were typically in excellent condition. This practice continued in various forms well into the Victorian era itself, drawing on both older battlefield collections and ongoing sources. Sit with that fact for a moment. A perfectly respectable Victorian citizen, dressed formally for a dinner party, smiling politely at their fellow guests, might very well have been doing so with a set of dentures containing teeth that had once belonged to a soldier who died on a distant battlefield decades earlier. The polished, respectable smile you might picture when imagining Victorian formality could, quite literally, have been borrowed from the dead. For those who managed to retain their own natural teeth, life was often not dramatically more comfortable, because toothache remained a near-constant companion for a great many people throughout their lives, with little effective treatment available beyond extraction or dubious folk remedies. Dentistry did advance significantly as the century progressed, with improved instruments, better techniques, and eventually the introduction of reliable anesthesia making dental treatment far less traumatic. The profession gradually became something closer to what we would recognize as legitimate, trained dentistry today. But for long stretches of the era, the Victorian relationship with dental health was overwhelmingly one of decay, persistent pain, and, in a striking number of documented cases, dentures quite literally borrowed from the dead. Let's talk now about what happened to Victorians who ran out of every other option: the very poorest, the sick, the elderly without family, the unemployed with nowhere left to turn. In theory, there was one final institution meant to catch them before total ruin. In practice, that institution, the workhouse, was designed quite deliberately to be as unpleasant as the law would permit. This wasn't an accident of poor administration or underfunding, though both of those problems existed as well. It was, by the explicit reasoning of the policymakers who designed the system, intentional. The core philosophy behind the New Poor Law of 1834, which established the modern Victorian workhouse system, was built around a principle known as less eligibility, the idea that conditions inside a workhouse needed to be worse than the living conditions of the poorest independent laborer outside its walls. The reasoning went that if workhouse life were made too comfortable, people might actually choose it over difficult paid work, which lawmakers of the era considered an unacceptable outcome. So deliberate hardship was built into the system by design, not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a calculated policy choice. The safety net, in a very real sense, was constructed out of dread. The very first thing that happened to a family entering a workhouse was separation. Husbands were housed apart from wives. Parents were separated from their children, often housed in entirely different wings of the same building, sometimes with only limited supervised opportunities to see one another at all. A family that arrived together, having exhausted every other option, was immediately broken apart into separate categories: men, women, children, the elderly, the infirm, each housed and managed independently. A mother might find herself living under the same roof as her own young children while being permitted to see them only rarely. This wasn't a bureaucratic oversight. It was explicit policy. intended in part to discourage families from viewing the workhouse as an acceptable, tolerable option. Inside, daily life consisted of a monotonous, deliberately unrewarding routine of labor performed in exchange for minimal food and shelter. Inmates were assigned tasks like picking apart old rope fibers, known as opium picking, breaking stone into gravel, or grinding animal bones, tasks that existed as much to occupy and discipline inmates as to produce anything of genuine economic value. Food was intentionally kept plain and minimal, enough, by the standards of the administrators, to sustain basic health, but deliberately no more generous than that, distributed within a strict, largely silent daily regime of rules and routine. Every element of workhouse life was structured to remind inmates, continuously, exactly how far they had fallen in the eyes of respectable society. And that sense of shame was, in many ways, the true underlying purpose of the entire system. To enter the workhouse was to be publicly marked as having failed, in the eyes of a society that largely preferred to believe poverty reflected personal moral failing rather than low wages, economic misfortune, illness, or simple bad luck. People genuinely dreaded the workhouse and went to considerable lengths to avoid it, because entering meant surrendering one's freedom, one's family unit, and a significant measure of personal dignity, all at once. Think about how this compares to what we'd consider a functional social safety net today. A genuine safety net is generally designed to catch people gently and help them recover their footing. The Victorian workhouse system, by contrast, caught people, separated them forcibly from their families, assigned them tedious and often pointless labor, fed them as minimally as administrators believed was tolerable, and ensured they experienced real social shame throughout the process. It was, in a meaningful sense, assistance delivered in a punitive framework, charity structured specifically to discourage its own use. To be fair to the historical record, there were genuine individual acts of kindness within these institutions, staff members who treated inmates with real compassion, and gradual reforms across the century that softened some of the harshest original provisions, particularly regarding children and the elderly. And the system, whatever its flaws, did prevent outright mass starvation for a great many people who had no other options remaining, which is not a small thing. But the underlying design philosophy remained deliberately harsh throughout most of the Victorian period. And for the people who actually passed through workhouse doors, the documented experience was, overwhelmingly, one of hardship and humiliation rather than genuine support. Now let's examine something we touched on earlier in more depth: the enormous, well-documented gap between the morality the Victorians publicly preached and the morality they privately practiced. The Victorians are remembered, quite fairly in many respects, for their public emphasis on strict moral codes, earnest religious sermons, and constant public discourse around virtue, decency, and respectability. What the era is considerably less famous for, though the historical evidence for it is extensive, is just how dramatically and consistently it failed to actually live up to those publicly stated ideals. Beneath the polished public manners and the frequent moral pronouncements ran a substantial underground economy of behavior that directly contradicted everything being preached from the pulpit. And nowhere is this gap between stated ideals and documented reality clearer than in the sheer scale of prostitution throughout the era, which we touched on earlier. In London and other major industrial cities, the sex trade operated on a scale that historians describe as functioning almost as an established industry, employing enormous numbers of women, and patronized regularly by many of the very same men who spent their public hours preaching restraint and moral discipline. The society that lectured most loudly and most publicly about purity was, according to the documented historical record, simultaneously one of the largest and most active markets for precisely the opposite behavior. Running through all of this was a glaring, well-documented double standard between how Victorian society treated men and women regarding sexual behavior and reputation. A woman who was discovered to have had a sexual relationship outside marriage, or who was merely suspected or rumored to have done so, could face total social ruin, public disgrace. Rejection by her family, the effective destruction of her marriage prospects and social standing, judged harshly and often permanently by the very same society that claimed to champion virtue. A man engaging in identical or considerably worse behavior could very often continue his life and career essentially unaffected, his indiscretions quietly overlooked, privately forgiven, or simply never publicly acknowledged in the first place. Virtue in practice was demanded intensely of women and expected only loosely, if at all, of men, and this arrangement was widely and quietly understood throughout Victorian society without needing to be stated openly. This represents, in many ways, the central open secret of Victorian morality. Public respectability functioned very much like a costume, worn carefully in the parlor at church and at the dinner table, and then set aside the moment the front door closed and the curtains were drawn for the evening. Many gentlemen of means kept mistresses. Prominent, publicly respected citizens visited establishments they would never have acknowledged in polite company. The public face and the private reality of Victorian life ran along two entirely separate, parallel tracks, and society as a whole had essentially agreed, tacitly, not to draw too much attention to the distance between them. What makes this particular hypocrisy so historically striking is the apparent sincerity behind the public performance. This was not, by most historical accounts, a society of people who openly acknowledged their hypocrisy and simply shrugged it off. Victorians largely committed fully and earnestly to the outward appearance of virtue, defended those standards sincerely in public discourse, and genuinely expected adherence to them from others, all while their own private behavior frequently and directly contradicted the very standards they publicly championed. The performance of morality was carried out with what appears to be genuine conviction, which is precisely why it succeeded so thoroughly in shaping how later generations came to remember the era. None of this suggests the Victorians were uniquely or unusually wicked as a society. Every historical era carries its own gap between publicly stated ideals and actual private behavior, and there were certainly plenty of genuinely sincere, principled people living during this period who did their honest best to uphold their stated values. But the specific popular notion that the Victorian era represented some particularly pure, uniquely moral period in Western history, that people living then were simply more virtuous as a rule than people living today, does not hold up particularly well once you examine the documented historical evidence in any real detail. Now let's step away from the drawing room entirely and look at where the majority of Victorians actually lived, because the tidy, rose-covered cottage of popular imagination represents only a small fraction of the housing reality of the era. Picture, for a moment, the comfortable popular image, a charming small house, a garden gate, roses growing along the door, smoke curling gently from a cozy chimney. That image existed for some Victorians, generally those from comfortable middle-class or wealthier backgrounds. For an enormous number of working-class Victorians, particularly in rapidly industrializing cities, actual housing conditions looked nothing like that picture at all. As Victorian cities grew explosively throughout the century, driven by an economy hungry for factory labor, urban housing construction simply could not keep pace with the sheer number of people arriving to fill those jobs. The result was severe, well-documented overcrowding across many industrial cities. In the poorest districts, families were frequently packed into cramped, poorly maintained buildings, with entire families sometimes occupying a single small rented room, where they slept, cooked, washed, and lived essentially their entire domestic lives in one confined space. Genuine privacy was essentially non-existent for families living under these conditions. These were not the tidy cottages of popular imagination. They were dense networks of narrow courts, dark alleyways, and tightly packed back-to-back housing, built so closely together that natural light and fresh air struggled to reach ground-level rooms at all. Some of the most severely overcrowded districts in cities like London, Manchester, and Glasgow became notorious in their own time, referenced repeatedly in contemporary journalism and government reports as symbols of urban poverty and neglect, housing far more residents than the original buildings had ever been designed to accommodate. Sanitation in these districts was, as you might expect after everything we've already covered tonight, genuinely catastrophic. A single shared outdoor toilet might serve numerous families simultaneously, with waste frequently accumulating faster than it could be properly managed or removed. Clean water was often scarce, drawn from a single shared source serving an entire overcrowded court or street. In conditions like these, infectious disease didn't simply spread gradually. It tore through densely packed neighborhoods with genuinely alarming speed, because virtually everything capable of transmitting illness was shared, cramped, and effectively impossible to avoid. Persistent dampness in poorly built, poorly maintained structures created additional health problems, and the overall living environment worked actively against basic health, comfort, and dignity at nearly every turn. This wasn't a rare misfortune experienced only by a small, unlucky minority. For enormous numbers of the urban working poor, the very people whose labor was powering Victorian industry, and by extension, the wealth of the empire itself, this represented ordinary, everyday housing reality. And here again is a detail worth genuinely sitting with. These severely overcrowded slum districts frequently existed within easy walking distance of considerable wealth and comfort, sometimes just a short distance from elegant residential streets and grand townhouses in the very same city. The comfortable cottage and the elegant townhouse were both genuinely real. They simply existed alongside, rather than in place of, this overcrowded, often desperate poverty. Social reformers, investigative journalists, and public health campaigners did eventually shine considerable public attention on these documented conditions throughout the Victorian era. Figures like Henry Mayhew, whose detailed journalistic investigations into London's poor were widely read, and later Charles Booth, whose systematic poverty mapping of London provided some of the first rigorous statistical documentation of the scale of urban poverty. Their work, combined with growing public awareness, eventually led to real improvements in housing regulation and public sanitation. Arriving gradually and unevenly across the second half of the century, genuine progress was made, but it came late, and it came only after decades of documented, largely ignored suffering. So while the cozy, rose-covered Victorian cottage was a genuine reality for some, it represented, for a considerable portion of the actual population, a comforting fantasy rather than lived experience. For a substantial share of Victorian society, home meant a single overcrowded room in a damp, poorly maintained, disease-prone building, shared with far too many other people, technically qualifying as housing in only the most minimal sense of the word. You might reasonably assume that a civilization as proud of its own progress as Victorian Britain would have sorted out something as basic as where its waste actually went. For a genuinely long time, the answer was troublingly simple, and it eventually created a crisis significant enough to force Parliament itself into action. For much of the early and middle Victorian period, human and industrial waste from London's rapidly growing population flowed, largely untreated, directly into the River Thames. The city's sewage system, such as it existed, was largely built around older systems designed for a much smaller population, and it simply could not handle the volume being generated by a metropolis that had grown to well over 2 million people by mid-century. The result was that the Thames, the very river running through the heart of the city, past Parliament itself, past countless grand buildings and public landmarks, functioned in practice as an enormous open sewer, carrying the accumulated waste of the entire population along its length. The consequences went well beyond unpleasant smell. Contaminated water spread disease with genuinely devastating efficiency, and London experienced several severe cholera outbreaks during this period, including major epidemics in 1832, 1849, and 1854, each killing thousands of residents. For much of this period, the true cause of cholera transmission was widely misunderstood by the medical establishment, who generally attributed the disease to miasma, or bad air, rather than contaminated water itself. This meant that public health efforts were frequently misdirected for years, focusing on improving air quality and ventilation rather than addressing the underlying contaminated water supply, while people continued to die in significant numbers. It's worth noting that this misunderstanding was directly and famously challenged during this period by the physician John Snow, who conducted careful epidemiological investigation during the 1854 Soho cholera outbreak and identified a specific contaminated water pump on Broad Street as the source of that particular outbreak, providing compelling evidence that cholera spread through contaminated water rather than bad air. Snow's methodical investigation is now widely regarded by historians of medicine as a foundational moment in the development of modern epidemiology. At the time, however, his conclusions were met with significant skepticism from much of the established medical community, and it took additional years and further evidence before germ theory more broadly gained wider scientific acceptance. Then came the summer that finally forced decisive action. In the summer of 1858, an unusually intense heat wave settled over London, and the already heavily polluted Thames, cooking in the summer heat, produced an odor so overwhelming, so genuinely inescapable, that it earned itself a lasting nickname in the historical record: the Great Stink. The smell rolling off the river became so severe that it reportedly forced the temporary suspension of court proceedings at nearby legal buildings, and crucially, it thoroughly infiltrated the Houses of Parliament itself, which sat directly on the riverbank. And here we arrive at what is, in many ways, one of the more revealing and quietly telling episodes of the entire era. The underlying sewage problem had existed for years already, primarily affecting the health and daily lives of London's poorer residents living closest to the most severely polluted stretches of the river, and the government's response up to that point had been notably slow and largely inadequate. But the moment the smell became severe enough that members of Parliament themselves could not comfortably work at their own desks, could not sit through a session in their own chamber without significant discomfort, suddenly, urgently, real funding and political will materialized almost immediately. Parliament moved with genuinely remarkable speed once its own comfort was directly affected, authorizing substantial funding for an ambitious, large-scale engineering solution. The civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to design and oversee construction of a comprehensive new sewer system for London, an enormous undertaking involving well over 1,000 miles of new sewer tunnels designed to intercept waste before it reached the Thames and carry it further downstream, away from the city center, for eventual treatment and discharge. Construction proceeded over the following decade, representing one of the truly great civil engineering achievements of the Victorian era, and remarkably, significant portions of Bazalgette's original sewer system remain in active use in London today, more than a century and a half later, a genuine, lasting triumph of Victorian engineering ambition. But it's worth remembering, honestly, how this particular triumph actually came about. The Victorians did eventually solve their sewage crisis, and they solved it with real engineering brilliance and genuine long-term vision. But they largely did so only after the underlying problem had been affecting the poorest residents of the city for years with minimal response, and only once the accumulated stench became personally, directly intolerable to the powerful men who actually held the authority to fund a solution. It stands as one of the more distinctly human episodes of the entire era, and that, given everything else we've covered tonight, is genuinely saying something. Now let's step out into the Victorian city after dark, because the popular image of orderly, well-mannered Victorian streets, where the worst danger you might encounter was a charmingly polite pickpocket, doesn't match the documented historical reality particularly well either. Victorian cities, particularly London, experienced genuine, well-documented crime on a considerable scale throughout the era, driven substantially by the severe economic inequality we've already discussed at length. Pickpocketing was extremely common in crowded public spaces, and skilled, often highly organized pickpockets worked busy markets, crowded streets, and public transportation with practiced efficiency, lifting purses, pocket watches, and handkerchiefs from distracted or unwary passers-by. In the poorest, most densely packed districts, more extensive organized networks of theft and fraud operated with real sophistication, and an unfamiliar visitor unaware of local dangers represented, quite literally, an opportunity waiting to be taken advantage of. Organized criminal gangs held informal territorial control over certain neighborhoods, adding a genuine element of danger and menace to particular districts of major cities. Violent street robbery was a real, documented concern as well. At one notable point in the mid-1850s, London experienced a genuine, well-documented public panic over a specific and frightening style of street robbery known as garroting, which involved an attacker approaching from behind and applying pressure to a victim's throat while an accomplice stole their valuables. This particular crime wave, heavily covered and arguably somewhat sensationalized by contemporary newspapers, generated significant public anxiety and even contributed to the passage of specific legislation, the Garroters Act of 1863, which increased penalties for this specific type of assault. And then, of course, there is the case that continues to loom over the entire era in popular memory, the still unidentified serial killer who murdered at least 5 women in London's impoverished Whitechapel district in the autumn of 1888, a case that captured intense public and press attention at the time and has never been definitively solved, despite well over a century of investigation, theories, and continued fascination. The case remains genuinely significant historically, not only for its enduring mystery, but because the extensive press coverage it generated brought unusually sustained public attention to the severe poverty and desperate living conditions in Whitechapel and similar East End districts, conditions that had generally received far less sustained public or governmental attention up to that point. The broader documented reality is that crime in Victorian cities was a genuine, persistent daily concern, shaped substantially by the severe economic inequality that placed considerable wealth and desperate poverty in close physical proximity throughout major cities. Theft and violence were driven significantly by economic desperation, limited opportunity, and the intense pressures of packing enormous, rapidly growing populations into tightly constrained urban spaces without adequate housing, employment, or social support systems. Authorities did respond as the century progressed, with the establishment of London's Metropolitan Police in 1829, one of the world's first organized, professional police forces, and its gradual expansion and development throughout the following decades. Law enforcement did become considerably more structured, professionalized, and systematic over the course of the era, with real, documented efforts made toward better crime prevention and detection methods. But the very scale and scope of Victorian policing efforts, which grew substantially throughout the century, itself serves as a reasonably good indicator of just how much crime there genuinely was to address throughout this period. Now, having covered a considerable amount of genuinely difficult material tonight, let's turn to something a bit warmer before we continue: the origins of the modern Christmas celebration. Because it's often claimed that the Victorians essentially invented Christmas as we now know it, conjuring the entire cozy tradition of trees, cards, and family gatherings more or less from nothing. The actual, documented history is a little more modest than that popular claim suggests, though genuinely interesting in its own right. Christmas, of course, was already a very old celebration by the time Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. People across Britain and much of Europe had been marking the midwinter season for centuries before the Victorian era began, with feasting, decorating homes with evergreen plants like holly and ivy, singing seasonal songs, and generally celebrating during the darkest stretch of the year, well before Victoria was ever born. The fundamental core of the celebration, gathering with family, sharing food, bringing light and warmth into the darkest season, was genuinely ancient. The Victorians didn't create that underlying tradition from nothing. They inherited it, and then reshaped and popularized it considerably. What the Victorians did accomplish, and did quite effectively, was take a range of older, somewhat scattered regional customs and consolidate them into the warmer, more explicitly family-centered, sentimentally focused holiday that we would broadly recognize today. They gave the existing holiday a considerably more domestic, emotionally focused character, and being enthusiastic Victorians, added a substantial and increasingly commercial dimension to the celebration as well. Consider the Christmas tree, one of the most recognizable symbols of the modern holiday. The custom of bringing a decorated evergreen tree indoors during the winter season actually originated in earlier German tradition, and was already known to some extent in parts of Britain before it became broadly popular. What genuinely helped popularize the custom widely across Britain was extensive newspaper coverage and popular illustrations depicting the royal family Victoria, her German-born husband Albert, who had grown up with the tradition, and their children gathered around a decorated Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. A widely circulated 1848 illustration of the royal family's Christmas tree, published in the Illustrated London News, is generally credited by historians with significantly accelerating the tree's adoption among ordinary British families eager to emulate the fashionable royal household. Nothing quite drives a new trend into popular adoption like seeing the most prominent, admired family in the country doing it first and publicly. Then there's the Christmas card, a much more directly and specifically Victorian creation. The custom of sending printed holiday greeting cards genuinely did originate during this era, emerging from the combination of an improving, increasingly efficient national postal system, following the introduction of the penny post in 1840, and the Victorian era's broader cultural fondness for sentimental, decorative correspondence. The first commercially produced Christmas card is generally credited to Henry Cole, who commissioned one in 1843, and the custom spread with remarkable speed once printing costs decreased and postal delivery became more affordable and reliable for ordinary households. Suddenly, a person could mail a small printed expression of seasonal goodwill to a wide circle of family and friends relatively cheaply, and a great many people promptly began doing exactly that, establishing an entirely new seasonal tradition of correspondence that continues in various forms today. And looming over all of this, of course, is one particularly famous piece of literature, Charles Dickens's novella, A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, telling the story of a miserly, isolated old man visited by spirits on Christmas Eve and ultimately transformed into a figure of generosity and warmth. This single, widely read story did an enormous amount to shape and popularize the modern conception of Christmas as fundamentally a time centered on family connection, charitable generosity, and personal redemption, spreading Dickens's particular vision of the holidays meaning very widely and effectively, and embedding it firmly and lastingly within broader popular culture in a way that persists strongly even today. So to summarize accurately, the Victorians took the already ancient winter feast, the evergreen decorations, the seasonal songs, and an existing tree tradition, added greeting cards, considerably more sentiment, and a substantially increased emphasis on gift-giving and seasonal commerce, incorporated one enormously influential piece of literature, and packaged the whole combination into a form so genuinely appealing and emotionally resonant that we have, in large part, simply continued celebrating it in very much the same way ever since. They didn't invent your cozy modern Christmas from nothing, exactly, but they did assemble it, quite skillfully, from pieces that were already available, and then popularized that particular assembled version so effectively that we still, in a meaningful sense, largely associate the holiday with them today. Let's turn now to something the Victorians approached with genuinely elaborate, highly structured formality: the practice of mourning the dead. We tend to assume that grief in past centuries was handled with quiet, private stoicism. The Victorians, by contrast, developed one of the most detailed, rule-bound, and in many ways genuinely theatrical mourning cultures in recorded history. For Victorian society, mourning was not treated as a purely private emotional experience to be managed quietly and personally. It functioned, in practice, as a highly visible public performance, governed by an extensive and widely understood set of social rules that specified appropriate behavior for a considerable period following a death. There were established expectations for how long different relatives should mourn, precisely what fabrics and colors were appropriate at each successive stage of mourning, and how a person in mourning was expected to behave in public. Deviating noticeably from these expectations wasn't merely a minor personal choice. It represented a genuine, closely noticed social misstep, subject to real social judgment from friends, family, and community. Widows faced by far the most demanding and extensive mourning expectations. A woman who lost her husband was generally expected to enter a period known as deep mourning, often lasting a full year or more, during which she wore exclusively black clothing made from specific, deliberately non-reflective fabrics such as crepe, chosen precisely because they were dull, lightless, and visually communicated grief, rather than any hint of vanity or normalcy. She was expected to withdraw substantially from most social occasions, avoid wearing any color, and generally avoid anything that might suggest she was not entirely consumed by grief for her husband. Only gradually, through a series of specifically defined subsequent mourning stages, second mourning, followed by half mourning, was she permitted to slowly reintroduce limited color into her wardrobe, typically starting with grays and eventually muted purples or lavenders, as though grief itself could be carefully measured out and rationed according to an established social calendar. The era's mourning customs extended even into jewelry, in ways that were genuinely both sentimental and, by modern standards, somewhat unusual. Mourning jewelry, dark, somber pieces specifically designed to mark a loss, was widely worn, and a distinctive category of these pieces incorporated the actual hair of the deceased person, carefully woven or worked into intricate patterns and set into brooches, rings, or lockets. A lock of a departed loved one's hair, transformed into a wearable, permanent keepsake, allowed the bereaved to keep a physical, tangible connection to the person they had lost close to them in daily life. Historians generally describe this practice as reflecting the era's complicated, intensely sentimental relationship with both grief and remembrance, tender in its underlying intention, while appearing genuinely unusual to modern sensibilities. This entire elaborate mourning culture was reinforced significantly from the very top of society, because the most visible, widely recognized mourner in the entire nation set an influential tone for everyone else. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria, as we discussed earlier, withdrew into a depth of grief that she genuinely sustained, in various forms, for the remaining decades of her exceptionally long life, nearly 4 full decades spent primarily in mourning dress. With the reigning monarch of the nation visibly and continuously mourning for that length of time, mourning practices of considerable intensity, effectively, became something of a broader social standard that a great many other grieving families felt genuine pressure to emulate as closely as their circumstances allowed. An entire commercial industry developed specifically to support these mourning practices. Specialized shops and suppliers dedicated to providing precisely correct mourning clothing, fabrics, and accessories appropriate to each specific stage of grief. A family experiencing genuine loss could, in principle, properly and correctly outfit their entire household in appropriate mourning attire, provided they had sufficient financial means to do so. This added a genuine, sometimes considerable financial burden to families already dealing with the emotional and often economic impact of losing a family member. Grief itself, in a very real practical sense, had become something that could be purchased, with real financial and social consequences for families unable to afford the correct mourning wardrobe. Consider how this compares to more modern approaches to grief and mourning, which generally lean toward privacy and a comparatively faster return to normal daily routines. The Victorians, by contrast, mourned visibly, publicly, at considerable expense, and for extended periods of time, wrapping their grief in strict, widely understood social rules and dark, specifically prescribed clothing, in a manner intended to be clearly seen and recognized by the surrounding community. It was neither a quick nor a simple cultural process, and it carried its own considerable, well-documented social pressures and expenses. Now let's step through the doors of another institution the Victorians relied on when someone's behavior or mental state fell outside what society considered acceptable: the Victorian asylum. If a Victorian's mental health genuinely declined, or their behavior deviated significantly from prevailing social expectations, the ideal, in theory, would have been access to compassionate, medically informed care. The documented historical reality of Victorian asylums was, unfortunately, considerably harsher and more troubling than that ideal in most cases. These institutions promised care and treatment, and in practice often delivered something considerably closer to confinement and control. Victorian asylums were, according to extensive historical documentation, frequently significantly overcrowded and chronically underfunded, housing far more patients than they could realistically provide adequate care for, operating on an understanding of mental health that was, by any modern medical standard, still extremely limited and often deeply flawed. The scientific understanding of mental illness during this period was genuinely in its early stages, and in the absence of that understanding, institutional practice was frequently shaped by a combination of guesswork, prevailing social moralizing about appropriate behavior, and an overriding emphasis on control and containment rather than genuine treatment. Patients were, in many documented cases, managed and contained rather than meaningfully treated or helped. And the practical difference between an asylum and a prison could be genuinely difficult to identify in a number of well-documented instances. Perhaps most troubling, from a modern perspective, is how relatively easily a person could be committed to an asylum during this period. The legal threshold required to have someone declared mentally unfit and confined could be distressingly low, often resting on the judgment of a very small number of individuals, evaluated against the rigid, narrow behavioral standards of a society with quite fixed and often unforgiving expectations about how people, and particularly women, ought to behave. This system was especially perilous for women, who could, in a number of well-documented historical cases, find themselves committed to asylums for reasons that amounted to little more than being considered inconvenient, being unusually emotionally expressive, displaying independence that a husband or male relative found difficult to manage, or otherwise simply failing to conform to the narrow, rigid social role expected of Victorian women. A woman who was perceived as too independent, too openly emotional, too assertive, or otherwise socially difficult could, with troubling ease in some documented cases, be labeled as mentally unwell and confined, often at the request of a husband or male family member. Once inside an asylum, the actual treatments offered ranged from largely ineffective to genuinely frightening by modern standards. In the absence of real scientific understanding, patients might be subjected to various forms of physical restraint, harsh and rigid daily regimes, cold and deliberately austere living conditions, and treatment methods with little genuine therapeutic value and considerable potential for causing additional harm and distress. The overriding institutional goal, in far too many documented cases, was subduing and managing difficult behavior rather than genuinely attempting to understand or address its underlying causes. A person who entered an asylum confused, distressed, or in genuine crisis might, under this approach, simply become more distressed, and then remain confined for a substantial, sometimes indefinite period. And indefinite is genuinely the operative concern here, because leaving an asylum could prove considerably more difficult than being admitted to one in the first place. Once a person had been formally committed and officially labeled as mentally unwell, they might remain confined for years, with any protest against their confinement frequently interpreted by asylum staff as additional evidence supporting the original diagnosis rather than a legitimate grievance. Demonstrating one's own sanity to staff and administrators already convinced otherwise proved, in a great many documented historical cases, to be extraordinarily difficult. The very act of objecting to confinement could itself be treated as further symptomatic evidence justifying that same confinement, creating a deeply troubling circular trap operating under a respectable institutional name. Consider how genuinely troubling this arrangement actually was in practice. An institution that publicly advertised care and eventual cure, one that families generally trusted and that broader society formally endorsed, could function in practice as a facility where vulnerable individuals were essentially warehoused indefinitely, where socially inconvenient family members could be effectively removed from daily life, and where unfortunate individuals could be gradually worn down by the very institution that was ostensibly meant to help them recover. The gap between the institution's stated public purpose and its documented practical reality was, in a great many cases, genuinely substantial. To give the era appropriate credit, there were dedicated reformers throughout the century who worked to improve asylum conditions, individual staff members who genuinely cared about and advocated for their patients, and gradual, real improvements in understanding and treatment approaches over time. The century did see meaningful, documented efforts toward more humane psychiatric treatment, and scientific understanding of mental health did slowly, if painfully, advance. But for a great many individuals who passed through the doors of a Victorian asylum, the documented historical experience was considerably closer to a prolonged sentence than to any genuine therapeutic refuge. Now let's directly address something we've referenced several times already tonight: the actual legal and social position of Victorian women, because the common, simplified image of the era, a passive, decorative woman waiting quietly on a sofa for male permission to participate in life, does not accurately reflect the fuller, more complicated historical reality. The standard popular picture of the Victorian woman often depicts a largely silent, decorative figure, confined to arranging flowers and managing polite conversation, her entire existence structured around waiting for male direction. She was, without any real historical dispute, genuinely constrained by significantly unequal laws and demanding, often unfair social expectations specific to her gender. But the broader notion that Victorian women were entirely without agency or influence, that they simply sat passively while the century unfolded around them, is, according to considerable historical evidence, a significant oversimplification, and one that arguably does a genuine disservice to the women who lived through this period. Let's be clear-eyed about the genuine legal constraints first, because they were real, substantial, and worth taking seriously. For much of the Victorian era, A married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into that of her husband under a legal doctrine known as coverture, meaning that a married woman generally could not independently own property, retain her own earnings, or enter into legal contracts in her own name without her husband's consent, until reforms like the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gradually began to change this. Women were entirely excluded from voting in national elections throughout almost the entirety of the Victorian period. Many professions, including law, medicine, and most positions in higher education, remained formally or informally closed to women for much of the era. Society scrutinized women's public behavior with a notably unforgiving, exacting standard. These constraints were genuinely real, structurally embedded, and significantly limiting. And yet, working both within and quietly around these substantial legal and social constraints, Victorian women accomplished a great deal that the simplified, passive popular image tends to overlook entirely. Many women managed households of genuine logistical complexity, which, in an era involving domestic servants, large families, and demanding social obligations, represented real organizational and managerial skill. A considerable number of women also ran businesses of their own, operating shops, managing trades, and successfully running enterprises with real skill and determination that the historical record has, until relatively recently, often significantly understated or overlooked entirely. The popular assumption that all Victorian women lived lives of complete leisure and financial dependence is simply not accurate. A great many women worked, and worked genuinely hard, whether within the home, in domestic service, in factories, or in independent trades and businesses of their own. Women also made major, lasting contributions to Victorian literature, and here their documented cultural influence and importance is genuinely undeniable. Women writers produced some of the most celebrated, enduring, and widely read literary works of the entire 19th century. Novels that were genuinely popular and influential at the time, and that remain widely read and studied today. Some published prominently under their own names, others initially published under male pseudonyms, specifically to circumvent the considerable literary prejudice against women writers that existed during this period. Through their writing, these women meaningfully shaped broader Victorian culture, contributed significantly to the era's most important and lasting stories, and in many documented cases achieved lasting literary influence and recognition that considerably outlasted the reputations of many of their male contemporaries and critics. Victorian women also organized and campaigned actively and persistently on a range of important social and political issues. Women organized, wrote extensively, argued publicly, and pushed determinedly for meaningful reform across numerous fronts, including expanded legal and property rights for women, improved working conditions in factories, and eventually the long, sustained campaign for women's suffrage, laying essential groundwork throughout the Victorian era for the more sweeping social changes that would follow in subsequent decades. The extended, difficult campaign for voting rights, expanded legal protections, and genuine access to professional careers was carried forward significantly by determined Victorian women who consistently refused to simply accept that their socially assigned role represented the final word on the matter. Meaningful social progress during this era did not simply happen on its own. A great deal of it was actively, persistently fought for, and secured through sustained effort by women themselves. Victorian women also served society in ways that produced lasting, transformative change, perhaps most famously through the pioneering nursing reforms associated with Florence Nightingale, whose work during the Crimean War and subsequent advocacy for improved sanitation and professional nursing standards fundamentally transformed the field of medical care and established nursing as a genuinely respected, organized profession, permanently altering what was considered achievable in medical care more broadly. Where formal institutional doors remained firmly closed to women, A considerable number of determined Victorian women actively found alternative paths and opportunities, often while publicly and carefully describing their considerable achievements in modest, socially acceptable terms, specifically designed not to draw unwanted or excessive attention. So, while it's genuinely accurate and important to say that Victorian women operated under substantial, well-documented legal and social restriction throughout this era, it would be a significant oversimplification, and frankly, an unfair one to the women who actually lived through the period, to suggest they were simply helpless or passive observers of their own era. Considerable historical evidence indicates that Victorian women wrote, worked, managed businesses, organized political and social campaigns, transformed entire professions, and meaningfully pushed their society forward, even while frequently being publicly expected to appear primarily decorative and quiet in the process. Let's turn now to something that sits in genuine, striking contrast with the era's reputation for scientific rationality: the Victorians' widespread, thoroughly documented enthusiasm for the supernatural. The Victorians are rightly remembered as a fundamentally scientific, rational society, one that made extraordinary advances in engineering, medicine, and the natural sciences, cataloging and explaining the physical world with a confidence and rigor previous centuries had never achieved. And yet, throughout this very same period, in many of these very same educated, scientifically literate households, an enormous and genuinely fashionable enthusiasm for communicating with the dead flourished, alongside all of that scientific progress. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate directly with deceased spirits, typically through a medium acting as an intermediary, swept through Victorian society as a genuine cultural phenomenon beginning in the 1850s and continuing with real popularity for decades afterward. This was not, importantly, a practice confined to the poorly educated or the socially marginal. It became a genuinely fashionable pastime among respectable, well-educated, and often quite intelligent people, who gathered in private drawing rooms specifically to attempt contact with deceased loved ones. Families and friends would sit together around a table, hands linked in a circle, waiting in dimmed light for some sign of contact from beyond, and a great many participants came away from these sessions genuinely, sincerely convinced they had experienced something real. At the center of this cultural phenomenon were professional mediums, individuals who claimed genuine spiritual ability to contact the deceased, and who performed these sessions, often for a fee, before eager and often paying audiences. Tables would reportedly tremble or tip during these séances. Mysterious knocking sounds would supposedly answer questions posed to the spirits. Objects in the room might seemingly move on their own. Disembodied voices or whispers might be heard, and elaborate spelled-out messages were sometimes produced, purportedly originating from the spirit world. Some mediums achieved genuine fame and considerable financial success through these performances, becoming minor celebrities in their own right within Victorian popular culture. A great deal of this activity has since been thoroughly documented, both at the time and by later researchers, as deliberate trickery, carefully rehearsed illusions, psychological techniques resembling what we would now call cold reading, and skilled physical sleight of hand, all carefully dressed up as genuine spiritual contact. Several prominent mediums of the era were, in fact, publicly exposed as frauds during their own lifetimes, sometimes through organized investigations. But what genuinely stands out to historians studying this phenomenon isn't primarily that people were deceived. Deception of this kind has existed throughout history. What stands out is precisely who was doing the believing and how seriously they took it. This was decidedly not a fringe superstition confined to society's uneducated margins. Spiritualism reached deeply into respectable Victorian society and genuinely captured the serious interest of accomplished, well-educated people, some of whom applied considerable intellectual effort to investigating these phenomena, sincerely believing there was genuine substance to be discovered and scientifically documented. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882 by a group that notably included several respected scientists and academics, was established specifically to investigate claims of spiritualism and related phenomena using methods intended to be rigorous and systematic. Even the prominent scientist Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection alongside Charles Darwin, became a committed, outspoken believer in spiritualism, to the considerable frustration and dismay of many of his fellow scientists. Why did spiritualism take hold of the era so powerfully? Several converging factors appear to have contributed. Death was an ever-present, unavoidable reality in Victorian life, given the era's persistently high mortality rates, particularly the tragically high rate of child mortality we discussed earlier, and the genuine, understandable longing to reconnect with lost loved ones was correspondingly powerful and widespread. There was also a broader cultural sense, driven by the era's genuine confidence in ongoing scientific and technological progress, that the spirit world might simply represent the next great unexplored frontier, one that careful investigation might eventually explain and document, just as science had already explained so much else about the physical world. And there was, quite honestly, a genuine element of thrill and mystery involved, a welcome, exciting departure from an era that otherwise prided itself heavily on hard, verifiable facts and empirical rigor. Reason and enchantment, as it turns out, coexisted quite comfortably within the very same Victorian households, and often within the very same individual minds. That coexistence is, in many respects, one of the genuinely fascinating contradictions of the era. This was the same century that produced monumental, transformative scientific advances, that dragged medicine forcefully toward modern practice, and that constructed extraordinary feats of engineering. And this was simultaneously a society that gathered regularly in darkened parlors, hands joined around a table, quietly awaiting a knock from beyond the grave. The rational, scientifically minded Victorian and the genuinely credulous Victorian were, in a great many documented cases, precisely the same person, marveling openly at a new scientific invention by day and earnestly attempting spiritual contact with the dead that same evening. Now let's sit down at the dressing table for a moment, because the era's pursuit of physical beauty carried its own genuinely significant, well-documented hidden dangers. The pale, flawless, almost luminous complexion so admired in old Victorian portraits and photographs came, in a genuine number of documented cases, at a startling and largely invisible physical cost. The dominant Victorian beauty ideal favored fashionable paleness, smooth, delicate, notably pale skin that signaled refinement, wealth, and importantly, a comfortable social distance from any form of outdoor manual labor, which tended to produce visibly tanned or weathered skin among the working poor. To achieve this fashionable pallor, some Victorian women turned to cosmetic powders and skin washes specifically designed to visibly whiten the complexion. The genuine, documented problem was that many of the most visually effective of these products contained lead compounds. Applied directly and repeatedly to the face over extended periods in pursuit of that fashionably pale look, lead does, in fact, produce a striking, smooth white finish. It is also, as is now very well understood medically, a genuinely serious cumulative poison, capable of being absorbed steadily through repeated skin contact by anyone determined enough to continue using it regularly over time. The documented long-term results were largely what modern medical understanding would predict. The very cosmetic products being used to create smooth, fashionably beautiful skin could, with sustained use over months or years, cause genuine, sometimes visible damage to that same skin, along with broader, more serious health consequences for the user. The immediate cosmetic mirror said one thing: the body's underlying physical condition, unfortunately, told a rather different and considerably more troubling story. Some Victorian women additionally sought an even paler, smoother cosmetic finish through more elaborate skin treatments, which in a number of documented cases only compounded their overall exposure to these harmful substances. And then there were the so-called complexion wafers, or arsenic complexion tablets. And this particular practice is almost difficult to fully believe from a modern vantage point. These were cosmetic products explicitly marketed and sold with the promise of achieving clear, pale, fashionably beautiful skin, not through any topical application, but through direct oral ingestion. Some of these products contained genuinely measurable doses of arsenic, taken deliberately and on a regular basis, based on the sincere popular belief that it measurably improved overall complexion and skin appearance. People were, quite genuinely, voluntarily and repeatedly consuming a well-known, notorious poison, specifically as an ongoing beauty regimen, trusting the confident, cheerful promises printed directly on the product packaging. Even the eyes received their own specifically dangerous cosmetic treatment during this period. To achieve the fashionably admired look of noticeably larger, darker, more striking eyes, some Victorian women used eye drops derived from the belladonna plant, commonly known as deadly nightshade, a name that fairly directly communicates its serious inherent toxicity. These particular drops worked by pharmacologically dilating the pupils, genuinely producing the fashionable, dramatic, wide-eyed look that was considered attractive and alluring during this period, at the real ongoing cost of regular exposure to one of the more effective and well-documented natural poisons readily available at the time. What ties all of these individual practices together and makes this particular chapter of Victorian history genuinely noteworthy is just how thoroughly ordinary and socially unremarkable this behavior actually was at the time. This was not the isolated, reckless behavior of a small, marginal group of women. These were fashionable, entirely respectable women, following the widely accepted beauty standards of their era, reaching confidently for cosmetic products that promised to deliver the era's most admired physical look, and in the process, often unknowingly, and in a genuine number of documented cases knowingly, paying for that appearance with their own long-term physical health. Now let's shift our attention to another area where Victorian ambition significantly outpaced Victorian safety standards: the railways, and the broader industrial workplace that powered this entire era of celebrated progress. Progress functioned as something close to a genuine secular religion during the Victorian era, and nothing preached that particular gospel more visibly or more loudly than the expanding railway network, which spread across Britain at remarkable speed throughout the century, standing as living proof to contemporaries that a genuinely new, faster, and grander future had truly arrived. It represented the era's proudest technological achievement, a shining, widely celebrated symbol of everything Victorian society believed and wanted to believe about its own progress and modernity. What that celebrated, polished public image tends to leave out entirely is just how genuinely dangerous this rapidly expanding new technology often was, particularly in its earlier decades. The railway system was still relatively new, expanding at genuinely breakneck speed throughout the middle decades of the century, and the necessary safety technology, standardized operating rules, and enforced safety regulations were, in a great many documented instances, still actively racing to catch up with the sheer scale and ambition of the rapidly growing network itself. The practical result was that serious accidents occurred with real, well-documented regularity throughout the era. Trains collided due to signaling errors or human miscommunication. Bridges occasionally failed structurally under load. Steam boilers sometimes ruptured catastrophically. Signals were periodically misread or simply misunderstood by operators working under considerable time pressure. Braking systems frequently proved genuinely inadequate for the speeds involved, particularly in the technology's earlier decades. When these enormous, heavy, rapidly moving machines that so genuinely thrilled Victorian society malfunctioned or were operated incorrectly. The results could be, and in numerous well-documented cases were, genuinely catastrophic in scale. Riding, what was widely celebrated as the great marvel of the age, carried real, measurable risk throughout much of the century. And passengers were, in a very real practical sense, active participants in an ongoing, evolving technological and safety experiment. And this wasn't a danger confined solely to the railways. The rapidly expanding factories that powered the broader Victorian industrial economy, that manufactured the goods, generated the considerable wealth, and drove the celebrated roaring economic growth of the era, were themselves, according to extensive historical documentation, remarkably dangerous places to work on a daily basis. The large industrial machinery that powered Victorian manufacturing had, quite literally, no built-in mechanism to protect the human workers operating it, and it maimed and seriously injured factory workers with genuinely troubling regularity. Fingers, hands, and in a significant number of documented cases entire limbs, were caught, crushed, or severed by fast-moving industrial machinery that never meaningfully slowed for operator safety. Within workplaces where basic protective safety measures were, for much of the century, essentially an afterthought, and where individual workers, tragically, were often considered readily replaceable by factory owners and managers. The fundamental underlying problem throughout this period was one of sheer pace. Everything about Victorian industrial and transportation technology was advancing considerably faster than practical understanding of how to operate that same technology safely. New machines, higher operating speeds, entirely new industries, and genuinely new methods of doing virtually everything arrived in rapid, continuous succession, while practical knowledge of how to adequately protect the workers actually operating this new technology consistently lagged well behind. Industrial and technological progress charged confidently forward throughout the era, while meaningful safety regulation and protective measures followed considerably more slowly and belatedly, arriving, in a great many documented cases, only after significant numbers of workers had already been seriously injured or killed. For an injured factory worker during this period, the practical consequences were frequently devastating and genuinely permanent. Losing a limb, or one's general health, to dangerous industrial machinery typically came with little to no meaningful financial support or formal compensation from employers, since comprehensive workplace injury compensation laws did not yet meaningfully exist for much of the Victorian era. An injured worker might simply be dismissed from employment, quickly replaced by the next available worker, and left largely to fend for themselves within a broader economic system that had extracted considerable ongoing labor from them, and in a great many documented cases, felt correspondingly little formal obligation once that worker could no longer continue providing that labor. The very real, ongoing human cost of celebrated Victorian industrial progress was paid, quite literally, in bodies, by working people whose names rarely, if ever, appeared in the celebratory illustrations and proud newspaper coverage of the era's industrial achievements. Over time, as the genuine scale of these documented workplace dangers became increasingly difficult for society and lawmakers to continue ignoring, meaningful reforms gradually began to take hold, including a growing and increasingly comprehensive body of railway safety regulation, factory legislation limiting hours and mandating certain basic safety measures, and gradual, genuine improvements in overall working conditions across numerous industries. The industrial machinery of Victorian progress did, over the course of the century, become measurably less routinely dangerous to operate. But that meaningful protection for ordinary workers came, in a great many well-documented cases, significantly later than it reasonably should have, and a great many working people were seriously injured or killed in the considerable meantime. Now, before we bring this journey to its close, let's step outside the crowded, industrial city entirely and consider whether the Victorian countryside genuinely offered the wholesome, healthier escape from urban hardship that popular imagination often assumes it did. Escaping urban conditions for the countryside might understandably sound like an obvious, healthier alternative, and you might reasonably imagine gently rolling green fields, generally content village residents, and a simpler, more genuinely healthy life lived in close harmony with the land. It's a genuinely appealing image. The documented rural reality for Victorian agricultural laborers, however, was, in a great many cases, simply poverty set against a considerably more scenic backdrop. Life for the typical Victorian farm laborer generally involved hard, physically demanding, continuous work in exchange for genuinely low wages. Working days were long, dictated by seasonal agricultural demands and available daylight, and the labor itself was frequently exhausting, physically punishing, and often yielded relatively little in the way of real, lasting financial security at the end of it. These were not, by documented historical accounts, the contentedly well-fed rural laborers of romanticized popular imagination. They were, in a great many well-documented cases, poorly compensated agricultural workers, frequently living close to genuine poverty, whose considerable physical labor kept Britain's agricultural economy functioning, while leaving comparatively little in the way of tangible economic benefit for the laborers themselves. Rural housing for agricultural workers was frequently cramped, structurally poor, and persistently damp, modest cottages that let in considerable cold and moisture, and offered comparatively little genuine protection against difficult weather. The genuinely romanticized image of the snug, comfortable country cottage, thatched roof, warm hearth, cozy interior, gives way, on closer historical examination, to significant overcrowding, persistent structural dampness, and documented hardship not dramatically different in its basic severity from the urban poverty already discussed at length, differing mainly in that there were considerably fewer outside observers present to witness and document it. Genuine poverty framed against a beautiful natural landscape remains. In practical daily terms, genuine poverty and pleasant scenery did comparatively little to fill an empty stomach or provide real financial security. Hunger represented a real, persistent, and ongoing threat throughout much of the rural Victorian working population, because agricultural livelihoods remained substantially at the mercy of factors entirely beyond any individual laborer's practical control. A poor harvest, an unusually harsh winter, or a change in a landlord's specific demands could quickly and dramatically shift a family from just barely managing to genuine, serious want. There was often comparatively little financial cushion, limited security, and correspondingly limited institutional mercy built into this particular economic arrangement for rural workers. Disease found its way into the countryside as readily as it did the cities, because underlying poverty, substandard housing, and physically demanding daily living conditions tend to produce sickness regardless of the surrounding natural scenery. The comforting popular notion that clean rural air alone functioned as some kind of protective health tonic, one that reliably kept country residents robust and healthy, doesn't hold up particularly well against the documented historical evidence. The same fundamental hardships that affected the urban poor, persistent dampness, chronic malnutrition, exhausting physical labor, took a genuinely comparable toll on the rural poor as well, occurring quietly among pleasant rolling hills that comparatively few outside observers ever thought to look closely at. This actually helps significantly explain a major demographic pattern of the era, why such enormous numbers of rural residents ultimately left the countryside altogether and moved to rapidly industrializing cities over the course of the century. They generally did not leave a genuinely comfortable, healthy rural existence for the considerable hardships of urban factory work purely out of restlessness or poor judgment, as some contemporary commentators occasionally suggested. They left, overwhelmingly, because the supposedly idyllic countryside simply wasn't reliably feeding them or their families. Agricultural wages remained persistently low, available work was often seasonally uncertain, and long-term prospects frequently appeared genuinely bleak, while rapidly growing industrial cities, for all their well-documented and very real problems, at least offered the realistic promise of steady employment and a reliable wage. People voted, quite literally, with their feet, and an enormous number of those feet walked steadily away from agricultural fields and toward expanding factory towns throughout the second half of the century. So the pastoral Victorian countryside was not, in documented historical practice, some untouched, healthy paradise for the people actually working it day to day. It was, for a great many rural laborers, hard, persistently poor, and economically precarious. However genuinely pleasant the surrounding natural scenery may have appeared to comfortable outside observers passing through. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight, so before we close, let's slow down and gather these threads together, because a pattern has been quietly running underneath everything we've explored this evening, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before you drift off. Think back over everything we've walked through. A society that performed strict public modesty while privately sustaining one of the largest markets for explicit material and paid intimacy in Europe. A population that smelled far more of coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed wool than of lavender and rosewater, and that had simply learned, out of necessity, to stop noticing. A fog so beautiful in paintings, and so genuinely lethal in daily life, that people wrote poetry about the very air that was quietly shortening their lives. A cup of tea that might be 1/3 actual tea leaf, and 2/3 hedge trimmings and dye, served with complete sincerity by a shopkeeper who likely didn't know either. A medical profession capable of extraordinary, genuine breakthroughs in one consulting room, and confidently prescribing mercury or bloodletting in the next. Children sent up chimneys and down mine shafts because their small size made them useful, in a society that had not yet decided childhood itself deserved protecting. Streets thick with mess that no amount of daily sweeping could ever fully clear. A dinner table where the bread might contain chalk, the milk might be watered down, and the candy, on one particular occasion, was accidentally laced with arsenic. Wallpaper so fashionable and so quietly toxic that redecorating a nursery could, without anyone realizing it, make an entire family unwell. An empire whose staggering wealth was real, and whose distribution left the overwhelming majority of its own citizens behind, sometimes within sight of the very mansions their labor helped build. A corset that was, for most women, simply practical underwear, wildly overshadowed in popular memory by a small number of genuinely extreme cases. A respectable household medicine cabinet stocked with opium, morphine, and sometimes cocaine, dispensed to adults and infants alike with total legal confidence. A queen remembered almost entirely for one grief-stricken half of her life, while the passionate, opinionated, joyful decades that came before her husband's death were quietly set aside by popular memory. A myth about photographed corpses that turned out, on closer inspection, to be mostly living people holding very still for a very slow camera. Surgeons who wore their blood-stained coats as a badge of honor, in an era before anyone fully understood why patients kept dying of infection after surviving the operation itself. A smile that might, quite literally, contain the teeth of a soldier who died on a distant battlefield decades earlier. A workhouse system deliberately designed to be worse than the worst available paid labor, so that desperation itself would keep people from asking for help. A public morality preached loudly from every pulpit and quietly abandoned the moment the front door closed, with an entire double standard built specifically to punish women for exactly what men were casually forgiven. A cottage on a biscuit tin standing in for a housing reality that, for enormous numbers of working families, meant one damp, overcrowded room shared among an entire household. A river so polluted it eventually had to poison Parliament itself before anyone found the political will to fix it. Streets that carried real, documented danger after dark, contrary to the polished, orderly postcard image. A Christmas we still celebrate largely because a queen's German husband liked decorated trees, and a struggling writer needed a bestseller that December. Widows measuring out their grief in specifically prescribed shades of fabric, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Asylums that could take in a difficult, inconvenient woman and never quite manage to let her out again. Women written off as decorative and dependent, who were, in a great many documented cases, running businesses, writing the century's most enduring novels, and organizing the campaigns that would eventually win them the rights that popular memory forgets they fought so hard for. Educated, rational minds sitting in darkened rooms, sincerely waiting for a table to answer their questions. Beauty routines that involved, without exaggeration, deliberately eating small amounts of poison. Railways and factories that built the modern world at a genuinely staggering human cost, paid quietly by workers whose names rarely made it into any history book at all. And a countryside that looked, from a comfortable distance, like a peaceful escape from the city, while offering many of its own residents much the same hunger and hardship, simply set against prettier surroundings. If any of that feels a little uncomfortably familiar as you listen tonight, that may be exactly the point worth sitting with for a moment. The Victorians were not some strange, distant, faintly ridiculous people, safely different from us, easy to laugh at from the comfortable distance of a couple of centuries. They performed respectability in public while living rather differently behind closed doors. They chased fashionable trends at real, sometimes serious cost to their own health, because everyone around them was doing the same thing, and it looked wonderfully impressive. They placed genuine trust in confident sellers and miracle cures, and they made the most reasonable decisions they could with the limited, often unreliable information available to them at the time, in a world where separating a genuine breakthrough from a confident scam wasn't always easy. Their patent tonics are, in a sense, not so different from any wellness fad promising the world today. Their willingness to believe a confident stranger is not so different from our own. And more than anything else, they told themselves flattering, comfortable stories about who they were as a society, that theirs was the most advanced, most moral, most civilized age the world had yet produced, and that the future would only look back and admire them for it. They were, in other words, just about as confident in their own progress and their own virtue as almost every generation tends to be, right up until the next one arrives to gently, patiently correct the record. The truth, as best as the historical evidence allows us to reconstruct it, is that the Victorians were not a cautionary cartoon, and they were not the elegant postcard image either. They were people genuinely clever and genuinely foolish in roughly the same proportions people tend to be in any era, kind and unkind, hopeful and self-deceiving, doing their sincere best within the real limits of what they understood at the time, and getting a considerable amount of it wrong along the way, exactly as every generation eventually does. Strip away the fog, the fashion and the framed portraits, and what remains underneath is, in many ways, strikingly recognizable. And yet, through everything we've covered tonight, people carried on living. They raised families in single crowded rooms. They fell in love, sometimes as passionately as any queen with her husband. They wrote novels that are still read with real pleasure today. They built sewers and railways and machines that reshaped the world, at a cost that history rarely names individually. They pushed their own society forward inch by inch, often against real resistance, towards something a little better than where it had started. They did not know, of course, that they were living inside a version of the past that later generations would misremember so thoroughly. They simply lived, as bravely and as imperfectly as anyone ever has. So tonight, as you settle further into your pillow, in a room with clean water at the tap, electric light at the flick of a switch, and you can rest fully assured of this much, not a single trace of arsenic anywhere on your walls, it might be worth sparing a quiet, grateful thought for them. For the people who endured the fog, the filth, and the well-intentioned soothing syrup, so that the comfortable, ordinary evening you're settling into right now could eventually exist at all. History, it turns out, is very often messier, stranger, and considerably more human than the postcard version we inherit. But it's also proof, in its own quiet way, that people have always found some means of enduring, adapting, and slowly building something better out of very imperfect circumstances. Rest well, you've more than earned it.